Chapter 15 of Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel. Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden by G.A. Henty. Chapter 15. A Mission. The next morning early, Ronald proceeded to take an inventory of the arms and ammunition left behind by the troops, when they had marched to join Sir John Cope at Stirling. Having done this, he saw that they were all packed up in readiness to be sent off the next day under the escort, who were also to convey the money which the city was required to pay. For the provost and council, knowing that it was useless to resist the order, and perhaps anxious in the present doubtful state of affairs to stand well with Prince Charles, had arranged that the money should be forthcoming of the following morning. After his work was over, Ronald again spent the evening at Andrew Anderson's. The next morning he returned to Edinburgh with the arms and escort. It was late when he arrived, but as he knew that Lord George Murray would be at work in his tent, he repaired there at once. "We have brought back the money and arms, Lord George. I have handed over the arms and ammunition at the magazine tent, and those in charge of the money have gone into the town with a part of the escort to give it over to the treasurer." "How many arms did you get?" 223 muskets and 80 pistols, 14 kegs of gunpowder, and well nigh a ton of lead." "That is more than I had expected. And now, Leslie, I have an important mission for you. The prince this morning asked me whom I could recommend, as a sure and careful person likely to do the business well, to go down into Lancashire to visit the leading Jacobites there, and urge them to take up arms. I said that I knew of none who would be more likely to succeed than yourself. Your residence of 2 years in France has rubbed off any Scotch dialect you may have had, and at any rate you could pass for a northern Englishman. In the next place, your youth would enable you to pass unsuspected where an older man might be questioned." The prince agreed at once, and took shame to himself that he had not before given promotion to one who was his companion on his voyage to Scotland, the more so as he had made Johnstone a captain. "Your claims are far greater than his, and moreover you have served as an officer in the French army. But in truth the fault is some degree your own, for you spend all your time in carrying out your duties, and do not show yourself at any of the levees or festivities. And you know, with princes, as with other people, out of sight is out of mind. However, the prince at once took steps to repair the omission, and has signed your commission as captain. Here it is. You will understand, of course, that it is for past services, and that you are perfectly free to decline this mission to the south, if you would rather not undertake it. It is unquestionably a dangerous one." "I will undertake it readily, sir," Ronald said, "and I thank you sincerely for bringing my name before the prince, and the prince himself for his kindness in granting me his commission, which so far I have done but little to win. I shall be able, I trust, to carry out this mission to his satisfaction, and although I am ignorant of the country, I shall have the advantage of taking with me my brave follower, Malcolm Anderson, who for years was in the habit of going with droves of cattle down into Lancashire, and will not only know the country but have acquaintances there, and being known as a drover, would pass without suspicion of his being engaged with politics." "That will do well," Lord George said. "I will get the list of persons on whom you should call prepared tomorrow. You had best go to Sir Thomas Sheridan and Francis Strickland, who came over with you, and get them to present you to Secretary Murray, and recommend you to him. If he hears that your mission is of my recommendation, he will do all he can to set the prince against you. Everything that I do is wrong in his eyes, and I do believe that he would ruin the cause in order to injure me, did he see no other way to accomplish that end. Therefore, if he mentions my name, as he is like to do, knowing that you have been my aide de camp, be sure that you say naught in my favour, or it will ruin you with him. You will, of course, attend the prince's levee tomorrow, and had best make preparation to start at nightfall." The next day, accordingly, Ronald called upon Sir Thomas Sheridan and Strickland, and telling them that the prince had determined to send him on a mission into Lancashire, asked them to present him to Secretary Murray, from whom he would receive orders for his guidance and instruction as to the persons whom he was to visit. The two gentlemen proceeded with him to the house in which Secretary Murray had taken up his abode, and introduced him with much warmth as a fellow passenger on the Doutelle. "You have been serving since as Lord Murray's aide de camp?" "Yes, sir, the prince recommended me to him at Perth, and I have since had the honour to carry his orders. Captain Leslie, for so the prince has granted him a commission," Sir Thomas said, "has served 2 years in the French army, and was present at Dettingen and Fontenoy. He mentioned to me on the voyage that he had the honour of being presented by Marshal Saxe to the King of France, and that he received his commission from the marshal, to whom he had acted as aide de camp at Fontenoy." "You have begun well indeed, young sir," Murray said, "to have received at your age, for I judge that you are not yet 20, commissions in the French army and ours." Ronald bowed. "He has another claim upon all you Scottish gentlemen," Sir Thomas said, "for Colonel Macdonald told us, when he introduced him to us at Nantes, that it was through his interference and aid alone that he escaped safely from Glasgow, and that all his papers, with the names of the king's friends in Scotland, did not fall into George's hands. He was taken prisoner for his share in that affair, but escaped from the ship in the Thames, and succeeded in crossing to France. So you see, young as he is, he has rendered good service to the cause." The expression of the secretary's face, which had before been cold and distant, changed at once. He had been aware that Ronald had been chosen for this business on the recommendation of Lord George Murray, and his jealousy of that nobleman had at once set him against Ronald, of whose antecedents he was entirely ignorant; but what he now heard entirely altered the case, and disposed him most favourably towards him, especially as his own name would have been one of the most prominent in the list, he having been in constant communication with Colonel Macdonald during the stay of the latter in Scotland. "I had no idea it was to you that we are all so indebted," he said warmly. "I heard from Colonel Macdonald, after his return from France, that he owed escape entirely to the quickness and bravery of a young gentleman whose name he was ignorant, but who he feared would suffer for his interference on his behalf, and prayed me and all other loyal gentlemen of Scotland to befriend you should they ever discover your name, for that we assuredly owed it to you that we escaped imprisonment, if not worse. I am truly glad to meet you and thank you in person. And so you are going on this mission?" "I have undertaken to do my best, sir. Fortunately I have a faithful follower who fought beside my father in '15, followed him to France, and fought by his side in the Scottish Dragoons for 15 years, and who has since been my best friend. He worked for years, when I was a child, as a drover of cattle from the Highlands into England. He knows Cumberland and Lancashire well, and would be known at every wayside inn. He will accompany me, and I shall pass as his nephew, therefore no suspicion will be likely to light upon me." "And you set out tonight?" "Yes, sir, if my orders and letters are ready." "There will not be many letters," the secretary said. "It would not do for you to have documents upon you which might betray you and our friends there should you be arrested. I will give you a list of the gentlemen on whom you have to call, which you had best learn by heart and destroy before you cross the frontier. You shall have one paper only, and that written so small that it can be carried in a quill. This you can show to one after the other. If you find you are in danger of arrest you can destroy or swallow it. I will give them to you at the prince's levee this afternoon, and will send to your tent a purse of gold for your expenses." "I shall need but little for that, sir," Ronald said, smiling. "For your expenses, no," the secretary said, "but one can never say what money may be required for. You may have to buy fresh horses, you may want it to bribe someone to conceal you. Money is always useful, my young friend. By the way, what family of Leslies do you belong to? I heard that one of your name had accompanied the prince, but no more." "My father was Leslie of Glenlyon." "Indeed!" the secretary exclaimed. "Of course, I know the name well. The lands were confiscated, but we shall soon set that right, and I will see that they are added to when the time comes to reward the king's friends and punish his foes." Ronald now took his leave and returned to Malcolm, who was making preparation for the enterprise. He had already purchased 2 suits of clothes, such as would be worn by Lowland drovers, and was in high spirits, being more elated than was Ronald himself at the latter's promotion. In the course of the day he bought 2 rough ponies, as being more suitable for the position they were to assume than the horses with which they had been furnished at Perth. Ronald attended the levee, and thanked the prince for the favour which he had bestowed upon him. "You are a young gentleman after my own heart," Prince Charles said, "and I promised myself on shipboard that we should be great friends, but I have been so busy since I landed, and you have been so occupied in my service, that I have seen but little of you. On your return I hope that I shall be able to have you near my person. I am half jealous of you, for while you are younger than I am, you have seen good service and taken part in great battles, but hitherto I have led a life almost of idleness." Ronald bowed deeply at the prince's gracious speech. On his return to the tent he found a messenger from the secretary, with a purse, which, on counting its contents, they found to amount to 100 guineas. They started immediately, and travelled 20 miles before stopping for the night at a small wayside inn. "This seems like old times to me," Malcolm said, as, after eating supper, they sat by a turf fire, "except that on my way down I had the herd to look after. There is no fear of our being questioned or suspected till we reach the border, for there is not an English soldier between the Forth and the Tweed, nor is it likely that we shall meet with any difficulty whatever till we get to Carlisle. Cope's forces, or what remain of them, are at Newcastle, and it will be there that the English will gather, and the western road is likely to be open until, at any rate, Prince Charles moves south. George's troops have plenty to think about without interfering with the Lowlands drovers. At the same time, after we have once crossed the Tweed, we may as well leave the high road. I know every bypath over the fells." On the third day after starting they crossed the border and were among the hills of Cumberland. They found that among the villages great apprehension existed. The tales of the rapine and destruction wrought in the old times by the Scottish forays had been handed down from father to son, and nothing less than the destruction of their homes and the loss of their flocks and herds was looked for. Malcolm was welcomed warmly at the little village inn where they put up for the night. "Why, it's well nigh 3 years since I saw you last," the host said, "and before that it was seldom 2 months without our seeing you. What have you been doing with yourself?" "I have been gathering the herds in the Highlands," Malcolm said, "while others have driven them down for sale, but at present my occupation is gone. The Highlanders are swarming like angry bees whose hive has been disturbed, and even if we could collect a herd it would not be safe to drive it south. It would be seized and despatched to Edinburgh for the use of the clans there." "Is it true that there are 50,000 of them, and that they have sworn to kill every English man, woman, and child?" "No, they are not so strong as that," Malcolm said. "From what I hear I should say they were not more than half, and I do not think there is any occasion for peaceful people to be afraid, for they say that the prince has treated all the prisoners who fell into his hands in the kindest manner, and that he said that the English are his father's subjects as well as the Scots, and that he will see that harm is done to no man." "I am right glad to hear it," the innkeeper said. "I don't know that I am much afraid myself, but my wife and daughter are in a terrible fright, and wanted me to quit the house and go south till it is all over." "There is no occasion for that, man," Malcolm said. "You will have no reason for fear were the whole of the clans to march through your village, unless you took it into your head to stand at the door and shout, 'God bless King George.'" "I care not a fig about King George or King James," the man said. "It's naught to me who is king at London, and as far as I know that's the way with all here. Let them fight it out together, and leave us hard working folks to ourselves." "I don't suppose either James or George would care for that," Malcolm said laughing, "but from what I have heard of Prince Charles I should say that there is nothing in the world that he would like better than to stand with broadsword or dagger against the Duke of Cumberland, and so settle the dispute." "That would be the most sensible thing to my mind," the innkeeper said. "But what brings you here, Anderson, since you have no herd with you?" "I am just getting out of it all," Malcolm said. "I have had my share of hard knocks, and want no more of them. I don't want to quarrel with the Highlanders or Lowlanders, and as trade is at a standstill at present there is nothing for me to do in the Highlands. I thought I would come south till it was all over. There is money to collect and things to look after, and I have to notify our regular customers that the herds will come down again as soon as the tempest is over, and between ourselves," he said in a lower voice, "I wanted to get my nephew out of harm's way. He has a hankering to go join the prince's army, and I don't want to let him get his brains knocked out in a quarrel which isn't his, so I have brought him along with me. He is a good looking fellow, I can see, and a strong one. I don't wonder that he wanted to mount the white cockade. Lads are always wanting to run their heads into danger. You have had your share of it, as you say, still you are wise to keep the lad out of it. I don't hold with soldiering, or fighting in quarrels that don't concern you." Malcolm and Ronald travelled through Cumberland and Westmoreland, calling upon many of the gentlemen to whom the latter had been charged to deliver Prince Charles's messages. They could not, however, flatter themselves that their mission was a success, for from few on those on whom they called did they receive assurances that they were prepared to take action. All the gentlemen professed affection for the Stuarts, but deprecated a descent into England unless the prince were accompanied by a strong body of French troops. The rising of '15 had been disastrous for the Jacobites of the north of England, and though all declared that they were ready again to take up arms and risk all for the cause of the Stuarts, if the prince was at the head of a force which rendered success probable, they were unanimously of opinion that it would be nothing short of madness to rise until at any rate the prince had marched into England at the head of a strong army. The principal personage on whom they called was Mr. Ratcliffe, a brother of the Earl of Derwentwater, who had been executed after the rising of '15. That gentleman assured them that he himself was ready to join the prince as soon as he came south, but that he wished the prince to know that in his opinion no large number of English would join. "The memory of '15 is still too fresh," he said, "while the Stuarts have been absent so long, that although there are great numbers who would prefer them to the Hanoverians, I do not believe that men have the cause sufficiently at heart to risk life and property for it. Many will give their good wishes, but few will draw their swords. That is what I wish you to say to Prince Charles. Among gentlemen like myself the feeling of respect and loyalty to his father's house is as strong as ever, and we shall join him, however desperate in our opinion the chances of success may be, but he will see that the common people will stand aloof, and leave the battle to be fought out by the clansmen on our side and George's troops on the other." Some weeks were passed in traversing the country to and fro, for the desired interviews were often only obtained after considerable loss of time. They could not ride up as two Highland drovers to a gentleman's house, and had to wait their chances of meeting those they wished to see on the high road, or sending notes requesting an interview, couched in such terms that while they would be understood by those to whom they were addressed, they would compromise no one if they fell into other hands. There was indeed the greatest necessity for caution, for the authorities in all the towns and villages had received orders from the government to be on the lookout for emissaries from the north, and they were frequently exposed to sharp examination and questioning. Indeed, it was only Malcolm's familiarity with the country, and the fact that he had so many acquaintances ready to testify that he was, as he said, a Scotch drover, in the habit for many years of journeying down from the north with cattle, that enabled them to escape arrest. After much thought they had decided upon a place of concealment for the quill containing Ronald's credentials, which would, they thought, defy the strictest scrutiny. A hole had been bored from the back into the heel of Ronald's boot, deep enough to contain the quill, and after this was inserted in the hiding place, the hole was filled up with cobbler's wax, so that it would need a close examination indeed to discover its existence. Thus, although they were several times closely searched, no document of suspicious nature was found upon them. Their money was the greatest trouble, as the mere fact of so large a sum being carried by two drovers would in itself have given rise to suspicions. Although they had been on their return towards Scotland, the possession of such an amount would easily have been explained as the proceeds of the sale of cattle they had brought down. They had therefore left the greater part of it with a butcher in Carlisle, with whom Malcolm had often had dealings, retaining only £10 for their necessary expenses. The day after they reached Manchester, 4 constables came to the little inn where they were stopping, and told them that they were to accompany them before the magistrates. "I should like to know what offence we are charged with," Malcolm said angrily. "Things have come to a pretty pass indeed, when quiet drovers are to be hauled before magistrates without rhyme or reason." "You will hear the charge quickly enough when you are before their worships," the constable said, "but that is no affair of mine. My orders are simply to take you there." "Well, of course we must go," Malcolm said grumblingly, "but here we have been well nigh 20 years travelling to and fro between England and Scotland, as my host here can testify, without such a thing happening before. I suppose somebody has been robbed on the highway, and so you sharp-sighted gentlemen clap hands on the first people you come across." 3 magistrates were sitting when Ronald and Malcolm were brought into the courthouse. They were first asked the usual questions as to their name and business, and then one of the magistrates said: "Your story is a very plausible one, but it happens that I have here before me the reports, sent in from a score of different places, for in times like these it is needful to know what kinds of persons are travelling through the country, and 2 men answering to your description are reported to have visited almost every one of these places. It is stated in nearly every report that you are drovers ordinarily engaged in bringing down the herds of Highland cattle, and it is added that in every case this account was verified by persons who have previously known you. All this would seem natural enough, but you seem to have journeyed hither and thither without any fixed object. Sometimes you have stopped for 2 days at little villages, where you could have had no business, and in short you seem for upwards of a month to have been engaged in wandering to and fro in such a way as is wholly incompatible with the affairs upon which you say you are engaged." "But you will observe, sir," Malcolm said quietly, "that I have not said I am engaged upon any affairs whatever. I am not come to England on business, but solely to escape from the troubles which have put a stop to my trade in the Highlands, and as for 15 years I was engaged in journeying backwards and forwards, and had many friends and acquaintances, I came down, partly, as I have said, to avoid being mixed up in the trouble, partly to call upon old acquaintances, and partly to introduce them to my nephew, who is new to the work, and will shortly be engaged in bringing down cattle here. I thought the present was a good opportunity to show him all the roads and halting places, in order that he might the better carry out the business." "Your story has been well got up," one of the magistrates said, "though I doubt whether there will be a single word of truth in it. However, you will be at present searched and detained until we get to the bottom of the matter. This is not a time when men can travel to and fro through the country without exciting a suspicion that they are engaged upon other than lawful business. At present I tell you that in our eyes your conduct appears to be extremely suspicious." The prisoners were taken to a cell and searched with the utmost rigour. Their clothes were examined with scrupulous care, many of the seams being cut open and the linings slit, to see if any documents were concealed there. Their shoes were also carefully examined, but the mud had dried over the opening where the quill was concealed, and the officials failed to discover it. Even their sticks were carefully examined to see if they contained any hollow place, but at last, convinced that, had they been the bearers of any documents, these must have been discovered, the officials permitted them to resume their clothes, and then, paying no heed to the angry complaints of Malcolm at the state to which the garments had been reduced, they left the prisoners to themselves. "Be careful what you say," Malcolm whispered to Ronald. "Many of these places have cracks or peepholes, so that the prisoners can be watched and their conversation overheard." Having said this, Malcolm indulged in a long and violent tirade on the hardship of peaceful men being arrested and maltreated in this way, and at the gross stupidity of magistrates in taking an honest drover known to half the countryside for a Jacobite spy. Ronald replied in similar strains, and any listeners there might have been would certainly have gained nothing from the conversation they overheard. "I should not be surprised," Malcolm said in low tones when night had come and all was quiet, "if some of our friends outside try to help us. The news will speedily spread that 2 men of the appearance of drovers have been taken on suspicion of being emissaries from Scotland, and it will cause no little uneasiness among all those on whom we have called. They cannot tell whether any papers have been found upon us, nor what we may reveal to save ourselves, so they will have a strong interest in getting us free if possible." "If we do get free, Malcolm, the sooner we return to Scotland the better. We have seen almost all those whom we are charged to call upon, and we are certainly in a position to assure the prince that he need hope for no rising in his favour before he comes, and that it is very doubtful that any numbers will join him if he marches south." The next morning they were removed from the cell in which they had been placed to the city jail, and on the following day were again brought before the magistrates. "You say that you have been calling on people who know you," one of the magistrates began, "and as I told you the other day, we know that you have been wandering about the country in a strange way. I now requite that you shall tell us the names of all the persons with whom you have had communication." The question was addressed to Malcolm as the oldest of the prisoners. Ronald looked round the court, which was crowded with people, and thought that in several places he could detect an expression of anxiety rather than curiosity. "It will be a long story," Malcolm said in a drawling voice, "and I would not say for sure but that I may forget one or two, seeing that I have spoken with so many. We came across the hills, and the first person we spoke to was Master Fenwick, who keeps the collie dog at Appleswade. I don't know whether your worship knows the village. I greeted him as usual, and asked him how the wife and children had been faring since I saw him last. He said they were doing brawly, save that the eldest boy had twisted his ankle sorely among the fells." "We don't want to hear all this nonsense," the magistrate said angrily. "We want a list of persons, not what you said to them." "It will be a hard task," Malcolm said simply, "but I will do the best I can, your worship, and I can do no more. Let me think. There was Joseph Repton and Nat Somner, at least I think it was Nat, but I won't be sure to his Christian name, and John Dykes, and a chap they called Pitman, but I don't know his right name." "Who were all these people?" the magistrate asked. "Joe Repton, he's a wheelwright by trade, and Nat Somner, he keeps the village shop. I think the others are both labouring men. Anyhow, they were all sitting at the tap of the Collie Dog when I went in." "But what have we to do with these fellows?" the magistrate exclaimed angrily. "I don't know no more than a child," Malcolm said, "but your worship ordered me to tell you just the names of the persons I met, and I am doing so to the best of my ability." "Take care, prisoner," the magistrate said sternly. "You are trifling with the court. You know what I want you to tell me. You have been to these villages," and he read out some 15 names. "What did you go there for, and whom did you see?" "That is just what I was trying to tell your worship in regular order, but directly I begin you stop me. I have been going through this district for 15 years, and I am known in pretty well every village in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. Having been away for 3 years, and my trade being stopped by the war, as your worship well knows, I have been going round having a crack with the people I know. Such as were butchers I promised some fine animals next time I came south. Such as were innkeepers I stayed a night with and talked of old times. If your worship will have patience with me, I can tell you all the names and what I said to each of them, and what they said to me, and all about it. I don't want to know about these things. I am asking you whether or not you have been calling on some of the gentry." "Indeed now!" Malcolm said with an air of astonishment, "and this is the first time that I have heard a word about the gentry since I came into court. Well, let me think now. I did meet Squire Ringwood, and he stopped his horse and said to me, 'Is that you, Malcolm Anderson, you rascal?' And I said, 'It's me, sure enough, squire.' And he said, 'You rascal, that last score of beasts I bought of you—'" "Silence!" shouted the magistrate, as a titter ran through the court. "All this fooling will do you no good, I can tell you. We believe that you are a traitor to the king and an emissary of the Pretender. If you make a clean breast of it, and tell me the names of those with whom you have been having dealings, there may be a hope of mercy for you, but if not, we shall get at the truth other ways, and then your meanness of condition will not save you from punishment." "Your worship must do as you like," Malcolm said doggedly. "I have done my best to answer your questions, and you jumped down my throat as soon as I opened my mouth. What should a man of my condition have to do with kings or pretenders? They have ruined my trade between them, and I care not whether King George or King James get the best of it, so that they do but make an end of it as soon as possible, and let me bring down my herds again. There's half a dozen butchers in the town who know me and can speak for me. I have sold thousands of beasts to Master Tregold, but if this is the treatment an honest man meets with I ain't likely to sell them any more, for as soon as I am let free and get the money the constables have taken from me, and I am off to Glasgow, and if I ever come south of the border again may I be hung and quartered." Finding that nothing was to be made out of the prisoners, the magistrate ordered them to be taken back to jail. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel. Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden by G.A. Henty. Chapter 16. The March to Derby. 2 days later, when the jailer brought in breakfast to their cell, he dropped on the table by the side of the loaf a tiny ball of paper, and then without a word went out and locked the back door. Malcolm put his finger to his lips, as Ronald was about to utter an exclamation of joy. "One's appetite is not as good here as it is when we were tramping the hills, Ronald, but one looks forward to one's meals. They form a break in the time." So saying, he took up one of the lumps of bread and began to eat, securing at the same time the pellet of paper. "We can't be too careful," he said in a whisper. "It is quite possible that they may be able to overhear us." "I don't see how," Ronald replied in the same tone. "I see no crack or crevice through which sound could pass." "You may not see one," Malcolm said, "but it may exist for all that. One of the boards of the ceiling may be as thin as paper, and anyone listening through could hear every word we say when we speak in our natural voices. The magistrates evidently believe that they have made a valuable capture, and would give anything to prove that their suspicions are correct. Now, I will go and stand at that grated opening and look at this paper. If they are watching us, they will see nothing then." The little piece of paper, when unfolded, contained but a few words. "Keep up your courage. You have friends without working for you. Destroy this." Malcolm at once again rolled up the pellet, put it into his mouth, and swallowed it. Then whispered to Ronald what he had just read. "I thought," he whispered, "that we should soon get a message of some sort. The news of our arrest will have set the hearts of a score of people quaking, and they would do anything now to get us out from this prison. They have already, you see, succeeded in bribing our warder." At his evening visit the warder passed into Ronald's hand a small parcel, and then, as before, went on without speaking. "I am confirmed in the belief that we can be overheard," Malcolm said. "Had the man not been afraid of listeners, he would have spoken to us. Now, let us see what he has brought us this time." The parcel contained a small file, a saw made of watch spring, and a tiny phial of oil. "So far so good," Malcolm said quietly. "Our way through these bars is clear enough now, but that is only the beginning of our difficulties. This window looks into the prison yard, and there's a drop of some 40 feet to begin with. However, I have no doubt our friends will send us the means of overcoming these difficulties in due course. All we have to concern ourselves about now is the sawing through of these bars." As soon as it was dark they began the work, relieving each other in turns. The oil prevented much sound being made, but to deaden it still further they wrapped a handkerchief over the file. The bars had been but a short time in position, and the iron was new and strong. It was consequently some hours before they completed their work. When they had done, the grating was left in the position it before occupied, the cuts being concealed from any but close observation by kneading up small pieces of bread and pressing them into them, and then rubbing the edges with iron filings. "That will do for tonight," Malcolm said. "No one is likely to pay us a visit, but if they did they would not notice the bars unless they went up and shook them. Tomorrow morning we can put a finishing touch to the work." As soon as it was daylight they were upon their feet. "It does very well as it is," Malcolm said, examining the grating. "It is good enough to pass, and we need not trouble further about it. Now collect every grain of those iron filings. No, don't do that on any account," he broke in, as Ronald was preparing to blow some of it from the lower stonework through the opening. "Were you to do that, it would be quite possible that one of the prisoners walking in the yard might see it, and would as likely as not report the circumstance to one of the warders, in order to curry favour and perhaps obtain a remission of his sentence. Scrape it inside and pour every atom down the crevices in the floor. That done, we are safe unless anyone touches the grating." They watched their warder attentively when he came into the cell, but this time he had no message for them. "We must not be impatient," Malcolm said. "Our friends have a good many arrangements to make, for they will have to provide our getting away when we are once out. Besides, they will probably have to bribe other warders, and that kind of thing can't be done in a hurry." It was not for another 2 days that the warder made any fresh sign. Then, as on the first occasion, he placed a pellet of paper on the table with their bread. "This is a good deal larger than the last," Ronald whispered. It was not until some little time after they had finished their meal that Ronald moved to the grating and unrolled the little ball of paper. It contained only the words, "You will receive a rope this evening. With this lower yourselves from your window into the courtyard. Start when you hear the church bells strike midnight, cross the court, and stand against the wall near the right corner of the opposite side. The third window on the second floor will be opened, and a rope lowered to you. Attach yourselves to this, and you will be pulled up from above." After reading the note Ronald passed it on to Malcolm, who, as before, swallowed it, but had this time to tear it into several pieces before doing so. The warder was later bringing their supper than usual that evening, and it was dark when he came in. As he entered the room he let the lamp fall which he carried. "Confound the thing!" he said roughly.
Here, take hold of this bread and let me feel for the lamp. I can't be bothered with going down to get another light. You can eat your supper in the dark just as well, I have no doubt." As he handed Ronald the bread, he also pushed into his hand the end of the rope, and while he pretended to search for the lamp he turned round and round rapidly, and so unwound the rope, which was twisted many times round his body. As soon as this was done he picked up the lamp, and with a rough "Good night," left them. "It is just as I suspected," Malcolm said in Ronald's ear. "There is a peephole somewhere, otherwise there could be no occasion for him to have dropped the lamp. It is well that we have always been on our guard." They ate their bread in silence, and then, after a short talk on the stupidity of the English in taking 2 drovers for messengers of Prince Charles, they lay down on their rough pallets to pass with what patience they could the long hours before midnight, for it was late in October, and it was little after 5 o'clock when the warder visited them. They felt but slight anxiety to the success of the enterprise, for they had no doubt that every detail had been carefully arranged by their friends without, although certainly it seemed a strange method of escape, that after lowering themselves from a 3rd-floor window they should afterwards be hauled up into a 2nd. At last, after what seemed almost an endless watch, they heard the church clock strike 12, and simultaneously rose to their feet. Not a word was spoken, for although it was improbable in the extreme that any watcher would be listening at that hour of the night, it was well to take every precaution. The grating was lifted out and laid down on one of the couches, so that all noise should be avoided. The rope was then strongly fastened to the stump of one of the iron bars. "Now, Malcolm, I will give you a leg up. I am younger and more active than you are, so you had better go first." Without debating the question, Malcolm put his foot on Ronald's hand, and in a moment was seated in the opening of the window. Grasping the rope he let himself quietly out, and lowered himself to the ground, reaching it so noiselessly that Ronald, who was listening, did not hear a sound. After waiting a minute, however, he sprang up onto the sill, and, feeling that the rope was slack, was soon by Malcolm's side below. They both removed their shoes and hung them round their necks, and walking noiselessly across the court they took up their post under the window indicated in the note. In less than a minute the end of a rope was dropped upon their heads. "You go first this time, Ronald," Malcolm said, and fastened it beneath Ronald's arms. Then he gave a pull at the rope to show that they were ready. The rope tightened, and Ronald found himself swinging in the air. He kept himself from scraping against the walls by his hands and feet, and was especially careful as he passed the window on the 1st floor. In a minute he was pulled into the room on the 2nd floor by the men who had hoisted him up. A low "Hush!" warned him that there was still a necessity for silence. The rope was lowered again, and Ronald lent his aid to hoist Malcolm up to the window. As soon as he was in, it was as slowly and carefully closed. "You are mighty heavy, both of you," a voice whispered. "I should not have thought it would be such hard work to lift up a man this height. Now follow us, and be sure you make no noise." 2 flights of stairs were descended, and they then stood before a small but heavy door. Some bolts were drawn, and a key turned in the lock, this being done so noiselessly that Ronald was sure they must have been carefully oiled. The 2 men passed through with them, locking the door behind them. "Thank God we are out," Malcolm said fervently. "I have been in a watch house more than once in my young days, but I can't say I like it better as I grow older." They walked for some minutes, and then their guides opened a door, and they entered a small house. "Stir up those peats, Jack," one of the men said, "and blow them a bit, while I feel for a candle." In a minute or two a light was obtained. "That's very neatly done, I think, gentlemen," laughed the man addressed as Jack, and who they now saw was the warder who had attended upon them. "We had rare trouble in hitting upon that plan. The cell you were in opened upon a corridor, the doors to which were always locked by the chief constable himself, and even if we could have got at his key and opened one of them, we should have been no nearer escape, for 2 of the warders sleep in the lodge, and there would be no getting out without waking them, and they could not be got at. They are both of them married men with families, and that sort of man does not care about running risks, unless he happens to be tired of his wife and wanting a change. Nat here and I have no encumbrances, and weren't sorry of a chance to shift. Anyhow, there was no way, as far as we could see, of passing you out through that part of the prison,
and at last the idea struck us of getting you out the way we did. That wing of the jail is only used for debtors, and they are nothing like so strict on that side as they are on the other. Some of the warders sleep there, so there is no difficulty in getting hold of the key for an hour and having a duplicate made. Till yesterday all the cells were full, and we had to wait till a man, whose time was just up, moved out. After that it was clear sailing." "Well, we are immensely obliged to you," Ronald said. "Oh, you needn't be obliged to us," the warder replied. "We are well paid for the job, and have promise of good berths if Prince Charles gets the best of it. Anyhow, we shall both make for London, where we have acquaintances. Now we are going to dress up. There's no time to be lost talking. There is a light cart waiting for us, and horses for you half a mile outside the town." He opened a cupboard and took out 2 long smock frocks, which he and his companion put on. "Now, gentlemen, will you put on these 2 suits of soldiers' clothes? I think they will about fit you." Ronald and Malcolm were soon attired as dragoons. "There's a regiment of them here," the man said, "so there was no difficulty in buying a cast-off suit and getting these made from it. As to the helmets, I guess there will be a stir about them in the morning. We got hold of a soldier today and told him he wanted a couple of helmets for a lark, and he said for a bottle of brandy he would drop them out of a barrack window at 10 o'clock tonight, and he kept his word. 2 of them will be surprised in the morning when they find that their helmets have disappeared. As to the swords and belts, I don't know that they are quite right, they were bought at an old shop, and I believe they are yeomanry swords, but I expect they are neat enough. I was to give you this letter to take with you. It is, as you see, directed to General Wade at Newcastle, and purports to come from the general of your regiment there, so that if by any chance you are questioned on the way, that will serve as a reason for your journeying north. Here is a purse of 20 guineas. I think that's about all." "But are we not to see those who have done us such service?" Ronald asked, "in order that we may thank them in person?" "I don't know who it is any more than the man in the moon," the warder replied. "It was a woman dressed as a serving wench, though I doubt it was only a disguise, who came to me. She met me in the street, and asked me if I should like to earn £50. I said I had no objection, and then after a good deal of beating about the bush it came out that what was wanted was that I should aid in your escape. I didn't see my way to working it alone, and I told her so. She said she was authorized to offer the same sum to another, so I said I would talk it over with Nat. He agreed to stand in, and between us we thought about the arrangements, but I never got to know any more about her. It was nothing to me whom the money came from, as long as it was all right. We have had half down, and are to have the other half when we get to the cart with you. And now, if you are ready, we will be starting. The further we get away from here before the morning, the better." They made their way quietly along the streets. The town was in total darkness, and they did not meet a single person abroad, and in a quarter of an hour they were in the open country. Another 10 minutes and they came upon the cart and horses. 3 men were standing beside them, and the impatient stamp of a horse's hoof showed that the horses were tied up closely. A lantern was held up as the party came up. "All safe?" "All safe," Ronald replied. "Thanks, many thanks to you for our freedom." The man holding the lantern was masked, so they could not see his face. He first turned to the 2 warders and placed a bag of money in their hand. "You have done your work well," he said. "The cart will take you 30 miles on your road and then drop you. I wish you a safe journey. You had best hide your money in your boots unless you wish it to fall into the hands of highwaymen. The London road is infested with them." With a word of farewell to Ronald and Malcolm, the 2 warders climbed into the cart. One of them mounted beside them and took the reins, and in another minute the cart drove away in the darkness. As soon as it had started, the man with the lantern removed his mask. "Mr. Ratcliffe!" Ronald exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, it is myself. There are half a dozen of us engaged in the matter. As soon as we heard of your arrest we determined to get you out. I was only afraid you would have been taken up to London before we could get all our plans arranged, for I knew they had sent up for instructions. It was well that we were ready to act tonight, for orders were received this afternoon that you should be sent up under an escort tomorrow. You puzzled them rarely at your examination, and they could make nothing of you. Our greatest fear was that you might betray yourselves in the prison when you fancied you were alone, for we learned from the men who have just left us that you were placed in a special cell where all that you said could be overheard, and your movements, to some extent, watched through a tiny hole in the wall, communicating with the cell next to it.
It widens out on that side so that a man can get his ear or his eye to the hole, which is high up on the wall, and but a quarter of an inch across, so that it could scarcely be observed unless by one who knew of its existence. The warders said that they could hear plainly enough through this hole, but could see very little. However, they do not seem to have gathered much that way.
We were on guard, sir. My friend Malcolm thought it possible that there might be some such contrivance.
And now, my young friend," Mr. Ratcliffe said, "you had best mount at once, follow this road for half a mile, and then take the broad road to the left. You cannot mistake it. It goes straight to Penrith. You have got the letter to General Wade?"
"Yes, sir, and the money. We are indeed in every way greatly indebted to you."
"Say nothing about it," Mr. Ratcliffe said. "I am risking my life as well as my fortune in the cause of Prince Charles, and this money is on his service. I hear he is already on the march south. Repeat to him when you join him what I have already told you, namely, that I and other gentlemen will assuredly join him, but that I am convinced there will be no general rising in his favour unless a French army arrive to his assistance. The delay which has taken place has, in my opinion, entirely destroyed his chances, unless he receives foreign assistance. Wade has 10,000 men at Newcastle, the Duke of Cumberland has gathered 8,000 in the Midlands, and there is a third army forming to cover London. Already many of the best regiments have returned from Holland, and each day adds to their number. Do all you can to dissuade him from advancing until French aid arrives, but tell him also that if he comes with but half a dozen followers, Charles Ratcliffe will join him and share his fate, whatever it be." With a hearty shake of the hand he leapt on his horse, and, followed by his servant, galloped off in one direction, while Ronald and Malcolm set out in the other.
"This is a grand disguise," Ronald said. "We might ride straight into Wade's camp at Newcastle without being suspected."
"I have no doubt we could," Malcolm agreed. "Still, it will be wiser to keep away from the neighbourhood of any English troops. Awkward questions might be asked, and although the letter you have for the general may do very well to impress officers of militia or newly raised troops we may meet on the road, and would certainly pass us as two orderlies conveying dispatches, it would be just as well not to have to appear before the general himself. Our swords and belts would probably be noticed at once by any cavalry officers. I know nothing about the English army, and do not know how much the yeomanry swords and belts may differ from those of the line. However, it is certain the less observation we attract from the soldiers the better, but as to civilians we can ride straight on through towns and villages with light hearts."
"We may as well breathe our horses a bit, Malcolm. Now there is no occasion for haste, and we can jog along at our own pace. There is no probability of pursuit, for when they find that we and the warders are missing and see the rope from our window, they will be sure that we shall have started early and are far away by the time they find out we are gone." Accordingly they travelled quietly north, boldly riding through small towns and villages, putting up at little inns, and chatting freely with the villagers who came in to talk over the news, for the north was all excitement. Orders had been issued for all the militia to turn out, but there was little response, for although few had any desire to risk their lives in the cause of the Stuarts, fewer still had any intention of fighting for the Hanoverians. When they arrived within a few miles of Newcastle, they left the main road and struck across the country, their object being to come down upon the road running north from Carlisle, for they thought it likely that parties of General Wade's troops would be scattered far over the country north of Newcastle. At a farmhouse they succeeded in buying some civilian clothes, giving out that they were deserters, and as they were willing to pay well, the farmer, who had no goodwill towards the Hanoverians, had no difficulty in parting with two of his best suits. They were now in a country perfectly well known to Malcolm, and travelling by byways across the hills, they crossed the Cheviots a few miles south of Carter Fell, and then rode down the wild valleys to Castletown, and thence to the Canoby of the Esk. As they entered the little town they found the wildest excitement prevailing. An officer with two orderlies had just ridden in to say that quarters were to be prepared for Prince Charles, and a quantity of bullocks and meal got in readiness for the use of the army, which would arrive late that evening. Ronald soon found the officer who had brought the order and recognized him as one of Lord Perth's aides de camp. He did not know Ronald in his present dress, but greeted him heartily as soon as he discovered who he was. "How is it the troops are coming this way?"
Ronald asked. "They are marching through Liddesdale from Kelso. We halted there for 2 days, and orders were sent forward to Wooler to prepare quarters. This was to throw Wade off the scent and induce him to march north from Newcastle to oppose us on that road, while, as you see, we have turned west and shall cross into Cumberland and make a dash at Carlisle." A few hours later the prince arrived with his army, and soon as he entered the quarters prepared for him Ronald proceeded there and made his report. "I could wish it had been better, Captain Leslie," the prince said, "but the die is cast now, and I cannot think that our friends in the north, who proved so loyal to our cause in '15, will hang back when we are among them. When they see that Charles Ratcliffe and other gentlemen whom you have visited range themselves under our banner, I believe the common people will join us also. Now give me a full account of your mission." Ronald gave the list of the gentry he had visited, and described his arrest and imprisonment in Manchester, and the manner in which Mr. Ratcliffe had contrived his escape. "You have done all that is possible, sir," the prince said, "and at an early opportunity I will show you I appreciate your services." On the next day, the 8th of November, the corps crossed the border. On the 9th they were joined by another column, which had marched from Edinburgh by the western road, and the united force marched to Carlisle and sat down before it. The walls of the city were old and in bad condition. The garrison was ill prepared for a siege. It consisted of a company of invalids in the castle, under the command of Colonel Durand, and a considerable body of Cumberland militia. The walls, however old as they were, could for some time have resisted the battery of 4-pounder guns which formed the prince's sole artillery. The mayor returned no answer to the prince's summons, and orders were issued to begin to throw up trench works, but scarcely had the operations begun when news arrived that Marshal Wade was marching from Newcastle to relieve the city. The siege was at once abandoned, and the prince marched out with the army to Brampton, and took up a favourable position there to give battle. The news proved incorrect, and the Duke of Perth with several regiments was sent back to resume the siege. On the 13th the duke began to raise a battery on the east side of the town, but after a few shots had been fired from the walls the courage of the besieged failed them. The white flag was hung out, and the town and castle surrendered on the condition that the soldiers and militia might march away, leaving their arms and horses behind, and engaging not to serve again for a year. On the 17th the prince made a triumphal entry into the place, but was received with but little show of warmth on the part of the inhabitants. A halt was made at Carlisle, and a council was held to determine upon the next step to be taken. The news which had been received from Scotland was very unfavourable. Lord Strathallan, who had been appointed by the prince as commander-in-chief, and directed to raise as many troops as possible, had collected between 2,000 and 3,000 men at Perth, and Lord Lewis Gordon had raised 3 battalions in Aberdeenshire, but on the other hand a considerable force had been collected at Inverness for King George. The towns of Glasgow, Paisley, and Dumfries had turned out their militia for the House of Hanover. The officers of the crowd had re-entered Edinburgh, and 2 regiments of cavalry had been sent forward by Marshal Wade to their support. While even Scotland was thus wavering, it seemed almost madness for the little army to advance into England. The greater portion of the Highlanders had from the first objected strongly to leave their country, and upwards of 1,000 had deserted and gone home on the march down from Edinburgh. They had started less than 6,000 strong, and after leaving a garrison of 200 men in Carlisle, but 4,500 were available for the advance south, while Wade, with his 10,000 men, would be in their rear, and 2 English armies of nearly equal strength be waiting to receive them. At the council the opinions of the leaders were almost unanimous against an advance, but upon Lord George Murray saying that if Prince Charles decided upon advancing, the army would follow him, he determined upon pressing forward. The army began its advance on the 20th of November, and halted a day at Penrith upon the news that Marshal Wade was moving to attack them, but the English general had not made any move, and the Scotch again pushed on through Shap, Kendal, and Lancaster to Preston. During the march Prince Charles marched with his troops, clad in Highland garb, and with his target thrown across his shoulder.
He seldom stopped for dinner, but ate his food as he walked, chatting gaily with the Highlanders, and by his cheerfulness and example kept up their spirits. The strictest discipline was enforced, and everything required by the troops was paid for. At Preston the prince on his entry was cheered by the mob, and a few men enlisted. From Preston the army marched to Wigan, and thence to Manchester. The road was thronged with people, who expressed the warmest wishes for the prince's success. But when asked to enlist they all hung back, saying they knew nothing about fighting. Still the feeling in favour of the prince's cause became stronger as he advanced south, and at Manchester he was received with acclamations of the inhabitants, the ringing of the bells, and an illumination of the city in the evening. The people mounted white cockades, and the next day about 200 men enlisted and were enrolled under the name of the Manchester Regiment, the command of which was given to Mr. Francis Townley, a Roman Catholic belonging to an old Lancashire family, who, with Mr. Ratcliffe and a few other gentlemen, had joined the army on the advance. The leaders, however, of the prince's army were bitterly disappointed at the general apathy of the people. Lancashire had in '15 been the stronghold of the Jacobites, and the mere accession of 200 or 300 men was evident that nothing like a popular rising was to be looked for, and they had but themselves to rely upon in the struggle against the whole strength of England. Marshal Wade was in full march behind them. The Duke of Cumberland lay at Lichfield in their front with a force of 8,000 veteran troops, while a third army, of which the Royal Guards were the nucleus, was being formed at Finchley. Large bodies of militia had been raised in several districts. Liverpool had declared against them. Chester was in the hands of the Earl of Cholmondeley. The bridges of the Mersey had been broken down. Difficulties and dangers multiplied on all sides. Prince Charles, ever sanguine, was confident that he should be joined by large numbers as he advanced south, but his officers were now thoroughly alarmed, and the leaders in a body remonstrated with Lord George Murray against any further advance. He advised them, however, to offer no further opposition to the prince's wishes until they came to Derby, promising that, unless by the time they were joined by the Jacobites in considerable numbers, he would himself, as general, propose and insist upon a retreat. Ronald utilized the short halt at Manchester to obtain new uniforms for himself and Malcolm, which he was glad to exchange for the farmer's garb, which had been the occasion of a good deal of joking and mirth among his fellow officers on the downward march. On the 1st of December Prince Charles, at the head of one division, forded the Mersey near Stockport, where the water was waist deep. The other division, with the baggage and artillery, crossed lower down at Cheadle on a hastily constructed bridge, and the two columns joined that evening at Macclesfield. Here Lord George Murray succeeded in misleading the Duke of Cumberland as to his intentions by a dexterous manoeuvre. Advancing with a portion of his force dislodged, and drove before him the Duke of Kingston and a small party of English horse posted at Congleton, and pursued them some distance along the road towards Newcastle under Tyne. The Duke of Cumberland, supposing that the prince's army were on their march either to give him battle or to make their way into Wales, where the Jacobite party were extremely strong, pushed forward with his main body to Stone. Lord George Murray, however, having gained his object, turned sharp off to the left, and, after a long march, arrived at Ashbourne, where the prince, with the other division of the army, had marched direct. The next afternoon they arrived at Derby, having thus altogether evaded the Duke of Cumberland, and being nearly 3 days' march nearer London than was his army. The prince that night was in high spirits at the fact that he was now within 130 miles of London, and that neither Wade's nor Cumberland's forces interposed between him and the capital. The prince that night was in high spirits at the fact that he was now within 130 miles of London, and that neither Wade's nor Cumberland's forces interposed between him and the capital. But his delight was by no means shared by his followers, and early next morning he was waited upon by Lord George Murray, and all the commanders of battalions and squadrons, and a council being held, they laid before the prince their earnest and unanimous opinion
that an immediate retreat to Scotland was necessary. They had marched, they said, so far on the promise either of an English rising or a French descent upon England. Neither had yet occurred. Their 5,000 fighting men were insufficient to give battle to even one of the three armies that surrounded them, scarcely adequate, indeed, to take possession of London, were there no army at Finchley to protect it. Even did they gain London, how could they hold it against the united armies of Wade and Cumberland? Defeat so far from home would mean destruction, and not a man would ever regain Scotland. In vain the prince replied to their arguments, in vain expostulated, and even implored them to yield to his wishes. After several hours of stormy debate the council broke up without having arrived at any decision. The prince at one time thought of calling upon the soldiers to follow him without regard to their officers, for the Highlanders, reluctant as they had been to march into England, were now burning for a fight, and were longing for nothing so much as to meet one or other of the hostile armies opposed to them. The prince's private advisers, however, Sheridan and Secretary Murray, urged him to yield to the opinion of his officers, since they were sure that the clansmen would never fight well if they knew that their chiefs were unanimously opposed to their giving battle. Accordingly the prince, heartbroken at the destruction of his hopes, agreed to yield to the wishes of his officers, and at a council in the evening gave his formal consent to a retreat. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel. Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden by G.A. Henty. Chapter 17. A Baffled Plot. Utterly disheartened and dispirited, the army commenced its march north. The prince himself was even more disappointed than his soldiers, and showed by his manner how bitterly he resented the decision at which his officers had arrived. It had seemed to him that success was within his grasp, and that he had but to march to London to overthrow the Hanoverian dynasty, and it is by no means improbable that his instincts were more correct than the calculations of his advisers. The news of his rapid march south had sent a thrill through the country, and although so far the number of those who had joined him was exceedingly small, at that moment numbers of gentlemen in Wales and other parts of the country were arming their tenants and preparing to take the field. There was no hostile force between himself and London, for the force at Finchley was not yet organized, and could have offered no effectual opposition. A panic reigned in the metropolis, and the king was preparing to take ship and leave the country. Had the little army marched forward, there is small doubt that James would have been proclaimed king in London. But it may be doubted whether Prince Charles could have maintained the advantage he had gained. Two armies, both superior to his own, were pressing on his rear, and would have arrived in London but a few days after himself, and although the Londoners might have accepted him, they would hardly have risen in arms to aid him against Cumberland's army. Had this halted at a distance, the reinforcements which might have joined the prince would have been more than counterbalanced by the regiments of English and Hanoverian troops which the king could have sent over, and although the strife might have been lengthened, the result would in all probability have been the same. Prince Charles had no ability in governing. His notions of the absolute power of kings were as strong as those of his ancestors, and, surrounded as he was by hot-headed Highlanders, he would speedily have caused discontent and disgust even among the most favourably inclined by hereditary tradition to the cause of the Stuarts. But of all this he was ignorant, and the retreat from Derby he saw the destruction of his hopes. Hitherto he had marched on foot with the Highlanders, chatting gaily as he went. Now he rode in rear of the column, and scarce engaged a word with even his most intimate advisers. The Highlanders no longer preserved the discipline which had characterized their southward march. Villages were plundered, and in some cases burned, and in retaliation the peasantry killed or took prisoners, stragglers and those left behind. Even at Manchester, where the reception of the army had been so warm a few days before, its passage was opposed by a violent mob, and the prince was so offended at the conduct of the townspeople that he imposed a fine of £5,000 upon the city. The next morning the march was continued. The Highlanders laid hands on every horse they could find, and so all pressed on at the top of their speed for the border. The Duke of Cumberland, who had fallen back in all haste for the protection of London, was close to Coventry when he heard that the Scotch had retreated northward. With all his cavalry, and 1,000 foot whom he mounted on horses supplied by the neighbouring gentry, he set out in pursuit. At Preston he was joined by another body of horse, sent across the country from the army of Marshal Wade, but it was not until he entered Westmoreland that he came up with the rear guard of the insurgents, which was commanded by Lord George Murray. Defeating some local volunteers who molested him, Lord George learned from the prisoners that the duke with 4,000 men was close at hand, and he sent on the news to the prince, who dispatched 2 regiments, the Stuarts of Appin and the Macphersons of Cluny, to reinforce him. It was nearly dark when by light of the moon Lord George saw the English infantry, who had now dismounted, advancing. He once charged them at the head of the Macphersons and Stuarts, and in a few minutes the English were completely defeated, their commander, Colonel Honeywood, being left severely wounded on the field, with 100 killed or disabled men, while the loss of the Scotch was but 12. It was with great difficulty that the Highlanders could be recalled from the pursuit, and Lord George himself sent an urgent message to the prince, begging for a further reinforcement, in order that he might maintain his ground and defeat the whole force of the duke. As usual, his wishes were disregarded, and he was ordered to fall back and join the main body at Penrith. The check, however, was so effective that the duke made no further attempt to harass the retreat of the Highlanders. Passing through Carlisle, some men of a Lowland regiment, and Colonel Toonley, with his regiment raised at Manchester, were left there as a garrison, so that the road should be kept open for another, and, as the prince hoped, not far distant invasion. The step was, however, a cruel one, for the Duke of Cumberland at once laid siege to the place, battered a breach in its ancient wall, and the garrison were forced to surrender. Many of them were afterwards executed and imprisoned, and ruin fell upon all. Charles with his army marched north to Glasgow, where they remained 8 days, requisitioning supplies from the town. During their stay Ronald and Malcolm put up at the house of Andrew Anderson. "What think you of the chances now, Malcolm?" Andrew asked his brother, after hearing what had taken place since he had last seen him. "I think no better and no worse of it than I did before, brother. They have had more success than I looked for. I did not think they would ever have got as far south as Derby. Who would have thought that a few thousand Highlanders could have marched half through England? But I see no prospect of success. The prince is badly advised. He has but one really good soldier with him, and he is set against him by the intrigues and spite of Secretary Murray and his friends, and partly, it may be, by Lord George's own frankness of speech. He has at his back but half the Highlands, for the other portion stand aloof from him. In the Lowlands he has found scarce an adherent, and but a handful in England. The Highlanders are brave, but it is surely beyond human expectation that 5,000 or 6,000 Highlanders can vanquish a kingdom with a brave and well-trained army with abundant artillery. Ronald and I mean to fight it out to the end, but I do not think the end will be very far off." "I am sorry for the young prince," Andrew said. "He is a fine fellow, certainly, handsome and brave and courteous, and assuredly clement. For 3 times his life has been attempted, and each time he has released those who did it without punishment. I could not but think, as I saw him ride down the street today, that it was sad that so fine a young man should be doomed either to the block or to lifelong imprisonment, and that for fighting for what he has been doubtless taught to consider as right. There are many here who are bitter against him, but I am not one of them, and I am so sorry for him, sorry for all these brave gentlemen and clansmen, for I fear that there will be a terrible vengeance for all that has been done. They have frightened the English king and his ministers too sorely to be ever forgiven, and we shall have sad times in Scotland when this is all over." 2 evenings later Ronald noticed that Andrew, who had been absent for some time, and had only returned just in time for supper, looked worried and abstracted, and replied almost at random to any questions put to him. "It is of no use," he said suddenly, when his wife had left the room after the conclusion of the meal. "I am a loyal subject of King George, and I wish him every success in battle, and am confident that he will crush out this rebellion without difficulty, but I cannot go as far as some. I cannot stand by and see murder done on a poor lad who, whatever his faults, is merciful and generous to his enemies. Malcolm, I will tell you all I know, only bidding you keep secret as to how you got the news, for it would cost me my life were it known that the matter had leaked out through me. This evening 5 of the council, knowing that I am a staunch King's man, took me aside after the meeting was over, and told me that there was a plan on foot to put an end to all the trouble by the carrying off or slaying of Prince Charles. I was about to protest against it, when I saw that by so doing I should, in the first place, do no good, in the second, be looked upon as a Jacobite, and in the third, be unable to learn the details of what they were proposing. So I said that doubtless it was a good thing to lay by the heels the author of all these troubles, and that the life of one man was as naught in the balance compared to the prosperity of the whole country. Whereupon they revealed to me their plan, asking me for a subscription of £100 to carry it out, and saying truly that I should get back the money and great honour from the king when he learned I had done him such service. After some bargaining I agreed for £50. "But what is the plot, Andrew?" Malcolm asked anxiously. "It is just this. The prince, as you know, goes about with scant attendants, and though there are guards in front of his house, there are but 2 or 3 beside himself who sleep there. There is a back entrance to which no attention is paid, and it will be easy for those who know the house to enter by that door, to make their way silently to his chamber, and either to kill or carry him off. I threw my voice in against killing, pointing out that the king would rather have him alive than dead, so that he might be tried and executed in due form. This was also their opinion, for they had already hired a vessel, which is lying in the stream. The plan is to seize and gag him and tie his arms. There will be no difficulty in getting him along through the streets. There are few folks abroad after 10 o'clock, and should they meet anyone he will conclude that it is but a drunken Highlander being carried home. You see, Malcolm, there is not only honour to be gained from the king, but the £30,000 offered for the prince's person. I pretended to fall in with the plan, and gave them the £50 which they lacked for the hire of the vessel, the captain refusing to let them have it save for money paid down. Now, Malcolm, I have told you and Ronald all I know about the matter, and it is for you to see how a stop may be put to it." "The scoundrels!" Malcolm said. "Their loyalty to the king is but a veil to hide their covetousness for the reward. When is it to take place, and how many men are likely to be engaged in it?" 6 trusty men of the city watch and their 5 selves. I said I would subscribe the money, but would have no active share in the business. They might have all the honour, I would be content with my share of the reward offered. 2 of them with 4 of the guards will enter the house and carry off the prince. The rest will wait outside and follow closely on the way down to the port, ready to give aid if the others should meet with any obstruction. The whole will embark and sail to London with him." "And when is this plot to be carried out?" Malcolm asked. "Tomorrow at midnight. Tide will be high half an hour later. They will drop down the river as soon as it turns, and will be well out to sea by the morning. And now I have told you all. I will only ask you to act so that as little trouble as possible may arise. Do not bring my name into the matter if you can avoid doing so, but in any case I would rather run the risk of ruin and death which would alight upon me when this rebellion is over, than have such a foul deed of treachery carried out. There is not a Scotchman but to this day curses the name of the traitor Menteith, who betrayed Wallace. My name is a humble one, but I would not have it go down to all ages as that of a man who betrayed Charles Stuart for English gold. Make yourself easy, brother. Ronald and I will see to that. When once treachery is known it is easy to defeat, and Ronald and I will see that your name does not appear in the matter." "Thank God that is off my mind," Andrew said, "and I will off to bed, or Janet will wonder what I am talking about so long. I will leave you two to settle how you can best manage the affair, which you can do without my help, for matters of this kind are far more in your way than in mine." "This is a villainous business, Ronald," Malcolm said when they were alone, "and yet I am not surprised. £30,000 would not tempt a Highlander who has naught in the world save the plaid in which he stands up, but these money-grubbling citizens of Glasgow would sell their souls for gain. And now what do you think had best be done in the matter, so that the plot may be put a stop to, and that without suspicion falling upon Andrew? It would be easy to have a dozen men hiding in the yard behind the house and cut down the fellows as they enter." "I do not think that would do, Malcolm. It would cause a tumult, and the fact could not be hidden. And besides, you know what these Highlanders are. They already loathe and despise the citizens of Glasgow, and did they know that there had been a plot on foot to capture and slay the prince, nothing could prevent their laying the town in ashes." "That is true enough. What do you propose then, Ronald?" "I think it best that if there should be any fighting it should be on board the ship, but possibly we may avoid even that. I should say that with 8 or 10 men we can easily seize the vessel, and then when the boat comes alongside capture the fellows as they step on to the deck without trouble, and leave it to the prince to settle what is to be done with them." "That is certainly the best plan, Ronald. I will get together tomorrow half a dozen trusty lads who will ask no questions as to what I want them to do, and will be silent about the matter afterwards. We must get from Andrew tomorrow morning the name of the vessel, and see where she is lying in the stream, and where the boat will be waiting for the prince." The next night Ronald and Malcolm with 6 men made their way one by one through the streets, so as not to attract the attention of the watch, and assembled near the strand. Not until the clock struck 12 did they approach the stairs at the foot of which the boat was lying. There were 2 men in it. "You are earlier than we expected," one said as they descended the steps. "The captain said 12:15." "Yes, we are a little early," Malcolm replied as he stepped into the boat. "We are ready earlier than we expected." A moment later Malcolm suddenly seized one of the sailors by the throat and dragged him down to the bottom of the boat. A handkerchief was stuffed into his mouth, and his hands and feet tied. The other was at the same time similarly secured. So suddenly and unexpected had been the attack that the sailors had no time to cry out or offer any resistance, and their capture was effected without the slightest sound being heard. The oars were at once got out, and the boat was rowed out towards the vessel lying out in the middle of the stream, with a light burning at her peak. As they approached the side the captain appeared at the gangway. "All is well, I hope?" he asked. "Could not be better," Malcolm replied, as he seized the rope and mounted the gangway, the others closely following him. As he sprang upon the deck he presented a pistol at the captain's head. "Speak a word and you die," he said sternly. Taken by surprise, the captain offered no resistance, but suffered himself to be bound. 2 or 3 sailors on deck were similarly seized and secured. The hatchway was fastened to prevent the rest of the crew from coming on deck, and the ship being thus in their possession, 2 of the men at once took their places in the boat and rowed back to the stairs. A quarter of an hour later those on board heard a murmur of voices on shore, and 2 or 3 minutes later the splash of oars as the boat rowed back to the ship. Ronald put on the captain's cap and stood at the gangway with a lantern. "All's right, I hope?" he asked as the boat came alongside. "All right, captain. You can get up your anchor as soon as you like." 2 men mounted onto the deck, and then 4 others carried up a figure, and were followed by the rest. As the last one touched the deck Ronald lifted the lantern above his head, and, to the astonishment of the newcomers, they saw themselves confronted by 8 armed men. The 6 men of the watch, furious at the prospect of losing the reward upon which they had reckoned, drew their swords and rushed forward, but they were struck down with handspikes and swords, for Ronald had impressed upon his men the importance of not using their pistols, save in the last extremity. In 2 minutes the fight was over. The 5 citizens had taken little part in it, save as the recipients of blows, for Malcolm, furious at their treachery, had bade the men make no distinction between them and the watch, and had himself dealt them 1 or 2 heavy blows with his handspike after he had seen that the guard was overpowered. The whole of them were bound, and warned that their throats would be cut if they made the least noise. The prince was released from his bonds, and he was at once conducted by Malcolm and Ronald to the cabin, where a light was burning. The prince was so much bewildered by the events that had occurred that he did not yet understand the state of the case. He had been awoke by a gag being roughly forced into his mouth, while at the same moment his hands were tightly bound. Then he was lifted from his bed, some clothes were thrown on him, a man took his place on either side, and thrusting their arms into his, threatened him with instant death if he did not come along with them without resistance. They had been hurried downstairs and along the streets, 2 men keeping a little ahead, and the others following behind. He had been forced into a boat and rowed up to a ship, and on reaching the deck a desperate combat had suddenly commenced all round him. Then the gag had been removed and the bonds cut. Bewildered and amazed, he gazed at the two men who had accompanied him to the cabin. "Why, Captain Leslie!" he exclaimed. "Is it you? What means all this scene through which I have passed?" "It means, your Royal Highness," Ronald said respectfully, "that I and my friend Malcolm obtained information of a plot on the part of some of the citizens to carry you off and sell you to the English. We could have stopped it by attacking them as they entered the house to seize you, but had we done so an alarm must have been raised, and we feared that the Highlanders, when they knew of the treachery that had been attempted against you, might have fallen upon the citizens, and that a terrible uproar would have taken place. Therefore we carried out another plan. We first of all obtained possession of the ship in which you were to have been taken away, and then overcame your captors as they brought you on board. All this has been done without any alarm having been given, and it now rests with you to determine what shall be done with these wretches." "You have done well indeed, Captain Leslie, and I thank you and your friend not only for the great service you have rendered me, but for the manner in which you have done it. I ought to have foreseen this. Did not the Lowlanders sell King Charles to the English? I might have expected that some at least would be tempted by the reward offered me. As for punishment for these men, they are beneath me. And moreover, if I can trust my eyes and ears, the knocks which you gave them will be punishment enough, even did I wish to punish them, which I do not. I could not do so without the story of the attempt being made known, and in that case there would be no keeping my Highlanders within bounds. As it is, they are continually reproaching me with what they call my mistaken clemency, and there would be no restraining them did they know of this. No, we had best leave them to themselves. We will order the captain to put to sea with them at once, and tell him he had best not return to Glasgow until I have left it. They will have time to reflect there at leisure, and as doubtless they have each of them given reasons at home for an absence of some duration, there will be no anxiety respecting them. And now, gentlemen, will you fetch in those who have aided in my rescue? I would thank every one of them for the service they have rendered, and impress upon them my urgent desire that they should say nothing to anyone of this night's work." While the prince was speaking to the men, Malcolm went out, and having unbound the captain, ordered him to deliver up the sum which he had received for the conveyance of the prince and his captors to England. The captain did as he was ordered. "How much is there here?" Malcolm asked. £300. Malcolm counted out 50 of it and placed them in his pocket, saying to Ronald, "There is no reason Andrew should be a loser by the transaction. That will leave 250, which I will divide among our men when we get ashore." Malcolm then gave the prince's orders to the captain that he must, immediately they left the ship, get up his anchor as before intended and make up to sea, and that under pain of being tried and executed for his share in this treacherous business, he was not to return to Glasgow with his 11 passengers for the space of a week. The prince and his rescuers then entered the boats and rowed to shore, and the prince regained his apartment without anyone in the house being aware that he had been absent from it. The next day the prince sent for Ronald and Malcolm, and in a private interview again expressed to them his gratitude for his rescue from the hands of his enemies. "I have none but empty honour to bestow now," he said, "but believe me, if I ever mount the throne of England, you shall see that Charles Edward Stuart is not ungrateful." The incident was kept a close secret, only 2 or 3 of the prince's most intimate advisers ever informed of it. These were unanimous in urging that an absolute silence should be maintained on the subject, for the fact that the attempt would certainly have been crowned with success had it not been for the measures Ronald had taken, might encourage others to attempt a repetition of it. Having rested his army by a stay of 8 days at Glasgow, Prince Charles set out on the 3rd of January, 1746, for Stirling, where he was joined by Lords John Drummond, Lewis Gordon, and Strathallan, the first named of whom had brought some battering guns and engineers from France. Their following raised the force to nearly 9,000 men, the largest army that Charles mustered during the course of the campaign. The siege of Stirling was at once commenced, but the castle was strong and well defended, and the siege made but little progress. In the meantime the Duke of Cumberland had been recalled with the greater part of his force to guard the southern coasts of England, which were threatened by an invasion by a French force now assembled at Dunkirk, and which, had it sailed before the Highlanders commenced their retreat from Derby, might have altogether altered the situation of affairs. The command of the English army in the north was handed by the Duke to General Hawley, a man after his own heart, violent in temper, brutal and cruel in conduct. He collected at Edinburgh an army of nearly the same strength of that of Prince Charles, and with these he marched out as far as Falkirk to raise the siege of Stirling, and, as he confidently boasted, to drive the rebels before him. Prince Charles, leaving a few hundred men to continue the siege, marched out to Bannockburn. The English did not move out from Falkirk, and the prince, after waiting for a day, determined to take the initiative. Hawley himself was stopping at Callendar House, at some distance from his army, and General Huske remained in command of the camp. To occupy his attention the prince dispatched Lord John Drummond with all the cavalry by the straight road by Stirling to Falkirk, which ran north of the English camp. They displayed, as they marched, the royal standard and other colours, which had the desired effect of impressing Huske with the idea that the prince with all his army was moving that way. In the meantime Charles, with his main force, had crossed the river Carron to the south, and was only separated from the English by Falkirk Muir, a rugged and rigid upland covered with heath. Just as the English were about to take their dinner, some country people brought in the news of the approach of the Highlanders. Huske at once got his men under arms, but he had no authority, in the absence of Hawley, to set them in motion. Messengers, however, were sent off on horseback at once to Callendar House, and the general presently galloped up in breathless haste, and putting himself at the head of his 3 regiments of dragoons, started for Falkirk Muir, which he hoped to gain before the Highlanders could take possession of it. He ordered the infantry to follow as fast as possible. A storm of wind and rain beat in the face of the soldiers, and before they could gain the crest of the moor the Highlanders had obtained possession. The English then halted and drew up on somewhat lower ground. Between them was a ravine which formed but a small depression opposite the centre of the English line, but deepened towards the plain on their right. The English artillery, in the hurry of their advance, had stuck fast in a morass, but as the Highlanders had brought no guns with them, the forces were equal in this respect. Lord John Drummond had from a distance been watching the movements of the English, and as soon as he saw that they had taken the alarm and were advancing against the prince, he made a detour, and, riding round the English, joined the Highland infantry. The prince's army was divided into 2 lines. Its right was commanded by Lord George Murray, the left by Lord John Drummond. The prince, as at Preston, took up his station in the centre of the second line on a conspicuous mound, still known by the name of Charlie's Hill. The English infantry were also drawn up in 2 lines, with the Argyll militia and the Glasgow regiment in reserve behind the second line. The cavalry were in front under Colonel Ligonier, who, at the death of Colonel Gardiner, had succeeded to the command of his regiment. General Hawley commanded the centre, and General Huske the right. The battle commenced by a charge of Ligonier, with his cavalry upon the Highland right. Here the Macdonald clansmen were posted, and these, at Lord George Murray's order, reserved their fire until the dragoons were within 10 yards, and then poured in a scathing volley, under which numbers of the horsemen went down. The 2 dragoon regiments, which had fled so shamefully at Preston and Coltbridge, turned and galloped at once from the field, but Cobham's regiment fought well, and, when compelled to retreat, rallied behind the right of the line. Lord George Murray endeavoured to get the victorious Macdonalds into line again, but these were beyond control, and rushing forward, fell upon the flank of Hawley's 2 lines of foot, which were at the same moment furiously assailed in front. The Highlanders, after pouring in their fire, dropped their muskets, and charged broadsword in hand. The English, nearly blinded by the wind and rain, were unable to withstand this combined assault. General Hawley, who at least possessed the virtue of courage, rode hither and thither in their front, trying to encourage them, but in vain. The whole centre gave way and fled in confusion. On the right, however, the English were defending themselves successfully. The 3 regiments placed there, on the edge of the ravine, maintained so steady a fire that the Highlanders were unable to cross it, and Cobham's dragoons charged down upon the scattered and victorious Highlanders in the centre, and effectually checked their pursuit. Prince Charles, seeing the danger, put himself at the head of the second line, and advanced against the 3 English regiments who still stood firm. Unable to withstand so overwhelming a force, these fell back from the ground they had held, but did so in steady order, their drums beating and covering in their retreat the mingled mass of fugitives. Had the Highlanders at this critical moment flung themselves with their whole force upon these regiments, then the English army would have been wholly destroyed. But night was already setting in, and the Scottish leaders were ignorant how complete was their victory, and feared an ambuscade. Lord John Drummond, a general officer in the French service, especially opposed the pursuit, saying, "These men behaved admirably at Fontenoy. Surely this must be a feint." The Highlanders remained stationary on the field until some detachments, sent forward by the prince, brought back word that the English had already retreated from Falkirk. They left behind them on the field 400 dead or dying, with a large portion of officers, and 100 prisoners. All their artillery, ammunition, and baggage fell into the hands of the Highlanders, whose total loss was only about 100. The English, on their retreat, burned to the ground the royal palace at Linlithgow. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bria. Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden by HENTY. Chapter 18. Culloden. The victory of Falkirk brought but little advantage to Prince Charles, and dissensions rose among the officers. Lord George Murray being furious with Lord John Drummond for preventing the complete destruction of the English army, while Lord John Drummond severely criticised Lord George for the confusion which had taken place among his troops after their success. Great numbers of the Highlanders, who had spent the night after the battle in plundering the English camp and stripping the slain, made off with their booty to the mountains, and the number of desertions was increased by the withdrawal of the greater part of Glengarry's clansmen. On the day after the battle the musket of one of the Clanranald clansmen went off by accident and killed the son of Glengarry. His clansmen loudly demanded life for life, and Clanranald having reluctantly consented to surrender his follower, the poor fellow was immediately let out and shot. But even this savage act of vengeance was insufficient to satisfy the Glengarry men, the greater part of whom at once left the army and returned to their homes. After the battle the siege of Stirling was renewed, but owing to the gross incompetence of a French engineer who had come over with Lord Drummond, the batteries were so badly placed that their fire was easily silenced by that of the castle guns. The prince, in spite of the advice of Lord George Murray and the other competent authorities, and listening only to his favourite councillors, Secretary Murray and Sir Thomas Sheridan, continued the siege, although on the 30th of January the Duke of Cumberland arrived at Edinburgh and took the command of the army. Never had Scotland a more bitter enemy. Relentless and savage as General Hawley had been, his deeds were more than rivalled by those of the Duke of Cumberland, who was justly branded by contemporary historians with the name of the Butcher. He was, however, an able general of great activity and high personal courage. After halting but one night in Edinburgh he set out at the head of his army to meet the enemy, but these did not repeat their tactics at Falkirk. Disgusted at the conduct of the prince in slighting their advice and listening only to his unworthy councillors, Lord George Murray with all the principal military leaders held a consultation and presented a memorial to the prince. In this they stated that, seeing the great numbers of Highlanders who had gone home, they were of opinion that another battle could not be fought with a chance of success, and therefore recommended that the army should at once retire to the Highlands, where a sufficient number of men could be kept together to defy the efforts of the enemy at such a season of the year, and that in the spring 10,000 Highlanders could be got together to go wheresoever the prince might lead them. Prince Charles was struck with grief and dismay at this decision, but as all the military leaders had signed it, he was forced to give way. The army at once blew up its magazines, spiked its guns, and marched for the north in 2 divisions with much confusion and loss of order. The Duke of Cumberland pursued, but was unable to come up to them, and halted at Perth. Ronald, who had from the time he returned to the army again taken up his former appointment of aide de camp to Lord George Murray, had during this time tried his best to reconcile the differences which were constantly breaking out between that general, the prince, and the clique who surrounded him. It was a difficult task, for Lord George's impetuosity and outspoken brusqueness, and his unconcealed contempt for Secretary Murray and Sheridan, reopened the breach as fast as it was closed. Since the day when he had saved the prince from being carried off at Glasgow, the latter had shown a marked partiality for Ronald's society, and the latter therefore had many opportunities of intervening to prevent open quarrels from breaking out. The prince himself was frequently greatly depressed in spirits, and the light-hearted gaiety which had distinguished him on the first landing was now fitful and short-lived. His disappointment at the failure of a campaign in which he had won every battle was deep and bitter. He had relied upon the aid of France, but no aid had come. He had been grossly misinformed as to the willingness of the Jacobites of England to take up arms in his favour, and although a portion of the Highlanders of Scotland had warmly embraced his cause, yet many on whom he had relied stood aloof or were in arms against him, while in the Lowlands he found but few adherents. So far from gaining ground he was losing it. Numbers of the Highlanders had gone off to their homes. The retreat from Derby had completely chilled the enthusiasm of his adherents, while the waverers and time-servers had been induced thereby to declare against him. The Duke of Cumberland's army steadily increased, and even had the advice of the Highland chiefs been followed and the army dispersed to reassemble in the spring, the chances of success would have been no more favourable than at present, for now that the first surprise and panic were past, England would put forth her whole strength, and would by the spring have an army assembled in Scotland against which the Highland clans, even if unanimous, could not hope to cope. Ronald was perfectly alive to the hopelessness of final success. He had seen the British infantry at Dettingen and Fontenoy, and felt sure that although the wild Highland rush had at first proved irresistible, this could not continue, and that discipline and training must eventually triumph over mere valour. When he and Malcolm talked the matter over together, they agreed that there could be but one issue to the struggle, and that ruin and disaster must fall upon all who had taken part in the enterprise. "I feel thankful indeed," Ronald said one day, "that I am here only as a private gentleman risking my own life. I do not know what my feelings would be if, like these Highland chiefs, I had brought all my kinsmen and followers with me into the field. The thought of the ruin and misery which would fall upon them would be dreadful. I fear that the vengeance which will be taken after this is over will be far greater and far more widespread than that which followed '15. All say that the Duke of Cumberland is brutal and pitiless, and the fact that we were nearly successful will naturally add to the severity with which the English government will treat us if we fall into their power. Had the enterprise been defeated at its commencement they could have afforded to be lenient. As it is, I fear they will determine to teach the Highlands such a lesson as will ensure their never again venturing to rise in arms against the House of Hanover." "And I don't know that they are altogether to be blamed," Malcolm said. "I am not so young as I was, Ronald, and I see now that I was wrong in teaching you to be a Jacobite. It is all very well for men like Tullibardine, who knew the Stuarts on the throne, to fight to put them back again, but to your generation, Ronald, the Stuarts are after all only a tradition, and it is a sort of generous madness for you to risk your life to set them again on the throne of England. It cannot matter a brass pin to you whether James or George rules at St. James's. It is not, as in the case of the Royalists in England in Charles's time or the Covenanters of Scotland, that a great principle is involved, a principle for which men may well risk their lives and all they hold dear. It is a question of persons only, and although I may hold that by right of descent Charles Edward is Prince of Wales and rightful heir to the throne, That is no reason why I should risk my life to place them there. And after all, it seems to me that if the majority in these islands determine that they will be ruled by the House of Hanover instead of the House of Stuart, they have some right to make their own choice." "You argue like a philosopher, Malcolm," Ronald said, laughing, "and do not remind me in the slightest degree of the Malcolm who used to chat with me in Glasgow." "You are right there, lad. You see I was brought up a Jacobite, and have been a soldier all my life, accustomed to charge when I was told to charge, and to kill those I was told to kill; but I own that since I have been out now I have got to look at matters differently. The sight of all these poor Highland bodies blindly following their chiefs and risking life, and all for a cause in which they have no shadow of interest, has made me think. A soldier is a soldier, and if he were to sit down to argue about the justice of every cause in which he is ordered to fight, there would be an end to all discipline. But these poor fellows are not soldiers, and so I say to myself, what concern have they in this matter? Their chiefs would gain honours and rewards, patents of high nobility, and additions to their estates if the Stuarts conquered, but their followers would gain nothing whatever. No, lad, if we get over this scrape I have done with fighting, and I hope that no Stuart will ever again succeed in getting Scotland to take up his cause. I shall go on fighting for Prince Charles as long as there is a man left with him, but after that there is an end of it as far as I am concerned, and I hope as far as Scotland is concerned." "I hope so too, Malcolm. When Scotland is herself divided, Ireland passive, and all England hostile, success is hopeless. The Stuarts will never get such a chance again as they had on the day when we turned our backs on London at Derby, and I will hope that they will not again make the attempt, especially as it is manifest now that France has only used them as tools against England, and has no idea of giving them any effectual aid." Charles, on approaching Inverness, found it toughly fortified and held by Lord Loudon with a force of 2,000 men. The prince halted 10 miles from the town at Moy Castle, where he was entertained by Lady Mackintosh, whose husband was serving with Lord Loudon, but who had raised the clan for Prince Charles. The prince had but a few personal attendants with him, the army having been halted at some distance from the castle. One evening Ronald had ridden over to Moy Castle with some despatches from Lord George Murray to the prince, and had remained there to dine with him. It was late before he mounted his horse. He was as usual accompanied by Malcolm. They had ridden but a short distance through the wood which surrounded the castle when a shot was fired, and almost immediately afterwards 4 or 5 men came running through the trees. "What is the matter?" Malcolm shouted. "The English army are upon us!" One of the Mackintoshes, for they were clansmen who had been sleeping in the wood, answered. "They must intend to seize the prince," Ronald said, "and will already have sent round a body of horse to cut off his retreat. Scatter through the woods, men, and do each of you raise the war cry of one of the clans as if the whole army were here. This may cause a delay and enable the prince to ride off. Malcolm, do you ride back with all speed to the castle and warn the prince of Loudon's approach." The Highlanders at once obeyed Ronald's orders, and in a minute or two the war cries of half a dozen of the principal clans in Prince Charles's army ran through the woods, while at the same time the Highlanders discharged their muskets. Ronald also shouted orders as to a large body of men. The English, who had made sure of effecting a successful surprise, hesitated as they heard the war cries of the clans ringing through the wood, and believing that the whole of Prince Charles's army were at hand and they were about to be attacked in overwhelming numbers, they retreated hastily to Inverness. No sooner had Ronald discovered they had fallen back than he rode to inform the prince that the danger was over. He found Prince Charles mounted, with Lady Mackintosh on horseback by his side, and the retainers in the castle gathered round, broadsword in hand, in readiness to cut their way through any body of the enemy's horse who might intercept their retreat. Charles laughed heartily when he heard of the strategy which Ronald had employed to arrest the advance of the enemy, and thanked him again for having saved him from falling into the hands of the enemy. The English made their retreat to Inverness in such confusion and dismay that the affair became known in history as the Rout of Moy. The next morning, the 17th of February, the prince called up his army, and the next day advanced against Inverness. Lord Loudon did not await his coming. The panic of his soldiers 2 days before showed him no reliance could be placed upon them, and embarking with them in boats, he crossed the Moray Frith to Cromarty, where the troops shortly afterwards disbanded on hearing that the Earl of Cromarty was marching against them with some Highland regiments. The town of Inverness was occupied at once, and the citadel surrendered in a few days. The army, now in a barren and mountainous region, was deprived of all resources. Many ships with supplies were sent off from France, but few of them reached their destination, several being captured by British cruisers and others compelled to go back to French ports. The supply of money in the treasury was reduced to the lowest ebb, and Charles was obliged to pay his troops in meal, and even this was frequently deficient, and the men suffered severely from hunger. Many deserted and others scattered over the country in search of subsistence. In the meantime the Duke of Cumberland's army was receiving powerful reinforcements. In February Prince Frederick of Hesse-Cassel, with 5,000 of his troops, who had been hired by the British government, landed at Leith. These troops were placed in garrison in all the towns in the south of Scotland, thus enabling the Duke of Cumberland to draw together the whole of the English forces for his advance into the Highlands. On the 8th of April he set out from Aberdeen with 8,000 foot and 900 horse. He marched along the coast accompanied by the fleet, which landed supplies as needed. At the Spey Lord John Drummond had prepared to defend the fords, and some works had been thrown up to protect them, but the English cannon were brought up in such manners that Lord John, considering the position untenable, retired to Inverness, while the English army forded the Spey, and on the 14th entered Nairn, where some skirmishing took place between the advance guard and the Highland rear. Prince Charles and his principal officers rested that night at Culloden House, and the troops lay upon the adjacent moor. On the morning of the 15th they drew up in order of battle. The English, however, rested for the day at Nairn, and there celebrated the Duke of Cumberland's birthday with much feasting, abundant supplies being landed from the fleet. The Highlanders, on the other hand, fasted, only one biscuit per man being issued during the day. Consequently many straggled away to Inverness and other places in search of food. Lord Cromarty, with the regiments under his command, were absent, so that barely 5,000 men were mustered in the ranks. At a council of war Lord George Murray suggested that a night surprise should be made on the Duke's camp at Nairn, and as this was the prince's own plan it was unanimously agreed to. Before, however, the straggling troops could be collected it was 8 o'clock at night. Nairn was 12 miles distant, and the men, weakened by privation and hunger, marched so slowly across the marshy ground that it was 2 o'clock in the morning before the head of the columns arrived within 4 miles of the British camp, while the rear was still far away, and many had dropped out of the ranks from fatigue. It was now too late to hope that a surprise could be effected before daylight, and the army retraced its steps to Culloden Moor. Worn out and exhausted as they were, and wholly without supplies of provisions, Lord George Murray and the other military officers felt the troops could not hope to contend successfully against a vastly superior army, fresh, well fed, and supported by a strong force of artillery on the open ground, and he proposed that the army should retire beyond the river Barn and take up a position there on broken ground inaccessible to cavalry. The prince, however, supported by Sir Thomas Sheridan and his other evil advisers, overruled the opinion of the military leaders and decided to fight on level ground. The Highlanders were now drawn up in order of battle in 2 lines. On the right were the Athole Brigade, the Camerons, the Stuarts, and some other clans under Lord George Murray. On the left the MacDonald regiments under Lord John Drummond. This arrangement unfortunately caused great discontent among the MacDonalds, just as their being given the post of honour at Falkirk had given umbrage to the other clans. At 11 o'clock the English army was seen approaching. It was formed in 3 lines with cavalry on each wing, and 2 pieces of cannon between every 2 regiments of the first line. The battle began with an artillery duel, but in this the advantage was all on the side of the English, the number of their pieces and the skill of their gunners being greatly superior. Prince Charles rode along the front line to animate his men, and as he did so several of his escort were killed by the English cannonade. A storm of snow and hail had set in, blowing full in the face of the Highlanders. At length Lord George Murray, finding he was suffering heavily from the enemy's artillery fire, while his own guns inflicted but little damage upon them, sent to Prince Charles for permission to charge. On receiving it he placed himself at the head of his men, and with the whole of the right wing and centre charged the enemy. They were received with a tremendous musketry fire, while the English artillery swept the ranks with grape, but so furious was their onslaught that they broke through Munro and Burrell's regiments in the first line and captured 2 pieces of cannon. But behind were the second line drawn up 3 deep, with the front rank kneeling, and these, reserving their fire until the Highlanders were close at hand, opened rolling fire so sustained and heavy that the Highlanders were thrown into complete disorder. Before they could recover themselves they were charged by horse and foot on both flanks, and driven together till they became a confused mass. In vain did their chiefs attempt to rally them. Exhausted and weakened in body, swept by the continuous fire of the English, they could do no more, and at last broke and fled. In the meanwhile the Macdonalds on the left remained inactive. In vain Lord George Drummond and the Duke of Perth called upon them to charge. In vain their chief, Keppoch, rushed forward with a few of his clansmen and died in front of them. Nothing would induce them to fight, and when the right and centre were defeated they fell back in good order, and joining the remnants of the second line, retired from the field unbroken. Charles, from the heights on which he stood with a squadron of horse, could scarce believe the evidence of his eyes when he saw the hitherto victorious Highlanders broken and defeated, and would have ridden down himself to share their fate, had not O'Sullivan and Sheridan seized his horse by the bridle and forced him from the field. Being pressed by the English, the retreating force broke into 2 divisions. The smaller retreated to Inverness, where the next day they laid down their arms to the Duke of Cumberland. The other, still preserving some sort of order, marched by way of Ruthven to Badenoch. 14 colours, 2,300 muskets, and all their cannon fell into the hands of the English. The loss of the victors in killed and wounded amounted to 310 men, that of the Highlanders to 1,000. No quarter was given to the stragglers and fugitives who fell into the hands of the English. The wounded were left on the ground till the following day without care or food, and the greater portion of them were then put to death in cold blood, with a cruelty such as never before or since disgraced an English army. Some were beaten to death by the soldiers with the stocks of their muskets, some were dragged out from the thicket or caverns to which they had crawled and shot, while one farm building, in which some 20 wounded men had taken refuge, was deliberately set on fire and burned with them to the ground. In any case such conduct as this would have inflicted eternal discredit upon those who perpetrated it, but it was all the more unjustifiable and abominable after the extreme clemency and kindness with which Prince Charles had, throughout the campaign, treated all prisoners who fell into his hands. Ronald had ridden close beside Lord George Murray as he led the Highlanders to the charge, but he had, as they approached the first English line, received a ball on the shoulder, while almost the same instant Malcolm's horse was shot under him. Ronald reeled in the saddle and would have fallen had not Malcolm extricated himself from his fallen horse and run up to him. "Where are you hit, lad?" he asked in extreme anxiety. "In the shoulder, Malcolm. Help me off my horse, and you take it and go on with the troops." "I shall do nothing of the kind," Malcolm said. "One man will make no difference to them, and I am going to look after you." So saying he sprang up behind Ronald, and placing one arm round him to support him, took the reins in the other and rode to the rear. He halted on rising ground, and for a short time watched the conflict. "The battle is lost," he said at last. "Lord George's troops are in utter confusion. The Macdonalds show no signs of moving, though I can see their officers urging them to charge. Now, Ronald, the first thing is to get you out of this and beyond the reach of pursuit." So saying, he turned the horse and rode away from the field of battle. "Does your shoulder hurt much?" he asked after they had gone a short distance. "It does hurt abominably," Ronald said faintly, as he was feeling almost sick from the agony he was suffering from the motion of the horse. "I am a fool," Malcolm said, "not to have seen to it before we started. I can't do much now, but at least I can fasten it so as to hurt you as little as possible." He took off his scarf, and telling Ronald to place his arm in the position which was most comfortable to him, he bound it tightly against his body. "That is better, is it not?" he asked as he again set the horse in motion. "Much better, Malcolm. I feel that I can go on now, whereas before I could not have gone much further if all Cumberland's cavalry had been close behind. How far are you thinking of going? I don't think my horse can carry double much further. Poor beast, he has had as short rations as his master, and was on the move all last night." "No, but we shall not have to make a very long journey. The English marched 12 miles before they attacked us, and I do not think they are likely to closely pursue far tonight. Besides, I have no intention of riding now that there is no fear of immediate pursuit. I think that in another 2 miles we shall be safe of any fear of the English cavalry overtaking us, for we shall then reach a forest. Once in that we shall be safe from pursuit, and shall soon be in the heart of the hills." On reaching the forest Malcolm dismounted, and leading the horse turned off from the road. Following a little trodden path they were soon in the heart of the forest, and keeping on for 2 hours and crossing several hills he stopped by the side of a stream. "We are perfectly safe here," he said, "and can sleep as securely as if we were in a palace." The saddle was taken off and the horse turned loose to graze. Malcolm then removed Ronald's coat and shirt, bathed the wound for some time with water, cut some pieces of wood to act as splints, and tearing some strips off his sash bound these tightly. "The ball has regularly smashed the bone, Ronald, and we must be careful to keep the shoulder in its proper position, or you will never look square again." "That does not seem very important to me just at present, Malcolm." "No, just at present the most important question is that of getting something to eat. We have had nothing today and not much yesterday, and now that we are no longer in danger of pursuit one begins to feel one is hungry. You stay here while I go and forage. There ought to be a village somewhere among the hills not far away. Do you know the country, Malcolm?" "I never came by this path, lad, but I have travelled pretty well all over the Highlands, and just as you found to be the case in Lancashire, there are few villages I do not know. I will first pull you a couch of this dead bracken and then be off. An hour's sleep will do you almost as much good as a meal." Ronald lay down on the soft couch Malcolm prepared for him, and before he had been alone for a minute he was fast asleep. The sun was setting when he awoke. Malcolm stood beside him. "Here is supper, lad. Not a very grand one, but there's enough of it, which is more than has been the case for some weeks." So saying he laid down by Ronald's side a large loaf of black bread, cheese made of sheep's milk, and a bottle of spirits. "The village is 5 miles away, which is further than I expected. However, I came back quicker than I went, for I had had a bowl of milk and as much bread as I could eat. I found the place in a state of wild excitement, for 2 or 3 of the men had just come in from the battlefield and brought the news with them. They are all for the Stuarts there, and you would be well entertained, but there is sure to be a search high and low, and you would not be safe in any village. However, a lad has promised to be here in the morning, and he will guide us to a lonely hut in the heart of the hills, used by the shepherds in summer. You will be perfectly safe there." "It is about 3 miles from the village," he said, "so I can go down 2 or 3 times a week and get food and learn how things are going on. The Highlanders may rally again and make another fight of it, but I hardly expect they will. They are not like regular troops whose home is naturally with our colours, and who, after the first rout, try to rejoin their regiments. There is no discipline among these Highlanders. Each man does as he likes, and their first impulse after a battle is to make for their homes. If it is a victory, to carry home their spoil; if they are defeated, for rest and shelter. At any rate, whether they gather again or not, you will have to keep perfectly quiet for a time. When your shoulder is perfectly healed we can act according to circumstances, and make for the army if there be an army, or for the sea coast if there is not." Although he had eaten but a short time before, Malcolm was quite ready for another meal, and sitting down beside Ronald he joined him in his assault upon the black bread and cheese. Then he collected some more of the bracken, mixed himself a strong horn of whisky and water, and a much weaker one for Ronald, after which the two lay down and were fast asleep. They were awake at sunrise, and shortly afterwards the lad whom Malcolm had engaged to act as guide made his appearance. The horse was saddled, Ronald mounted, and they started at once for their destination among the hills. They followed the path which Malcolm had taken the afternoon before for some 3 miles, and then struck off to the left. Half an hour took them out of the forest, and they journeyed for an hour among the bare hillsides, until, lying in a sheltered hollow, they saw the hut which was their destination. "They are not likely to find us here," Malcolm said cheerfully. "Even if they were to scale the mountains, they might ride within 50 yards of this hollow without suspecting its existence." "Where are we to get water?" he asked the lad in Gaelic. "A quarter of a mile away over that brow is the head of a stream," the lad replied. "You cannot well miss it." "That is all right," Malcolm said. "I don't mind carrying up provisions or a bottle of spirits now and then, but to drag all the water we want 3 miles would be serious." The door of the hut was only fastened by a latch, and they entered without ceremony. It consisted of but a single room. There were 2 or 3 rough wooden stools and a heap of bracken in one corner. Not a large amount of furniture, but in the opinion of a Highlander amply sufficient. "We shall do here capitally," Malcolm said. "Now what do you think about the horse, Ronald?" "Of course he might be useful if we were obliged to move suddenly, but we have no food to give him, and if we let him shift for himself he will wander about and might easily be seen by anyone crossing these hills. A horse is always a prize, and it might bring troops into our neighbourhood who would otherwise not have a thought about coming in this direction." "I quite agree with you, Ronald. The lad had better take him down to the village and give him to the headman there. He can sell him or keep him or get rid of him as he likes. At any rate he'll be off our hands." End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adele de Pignerolles. Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden, by G. A. Henty. Chapter 19. Fugitives. For 3 weeks Ronald and Malcolm remained in hiding in the hut among the hills. Every 2 or 3 days Malcolm went down to the village and brought back food. He learned that the remains of the army at Ruthven had entirely dispersed, the prince himself seeing the hopelessness of any longer continuing the struggle. Terrible tales of slaughter and devastation by Cumberland's troops circulated through the hills. The Duke had fixed his headquarters at Fort Augustus, and thence his troops ravaged the whole country of the clans lately in insurrection. Villages were burned, cattle slaughtered, women subjected to the grossest insult and ill treatment, and often wantonly slain, and the fugitives among the mountains hunted like wild beasts, and slain as pitilessly whenever overtaken. Ronald's arm was healing fast. Youth and a good constitution, and the care and attention of Malcolm, aided perhaps by the pure mountain air, did wonders for him. The splints had proved efficacious, and although they had not yet been taken off, Malcolm was confident that the injury would be completely repaired. One morning Malcolm had left but half an hour for the village when he returned. "The enemy are in the village," he said. "I can see clouds of smoke rising in that direction. We had better be off at once." "I can see clouds of smoke rising in that direction. We had better be off at once. They will be scouring all the hills here, as they have done elsewhere, and we had better get out of the neighbourhood." There was no packing to be done, and taking with them what remained of the food Malcolm had last brought, they started on their way. They made first for the spring from which they had drawn their water, and then followed the little stream on its way down the hill, as it flowed in the opposite direction to the village. An hour's walking took them into the forest. "Before we go further let us have a consultation," Malcolm said. "We are safe now from pursuit, and had better settle upon what course we intend to adopt. Shall we make for Glasgow, and lie hid there till things blow over a little, or make for the Isles, and stay there till we get a chance of being taken off by some French ship? That is what they say the prince has done, and indeed, as there would be no chance of his getting a ship on the east coast, and all the Lowlands are against them, he is certain to have made for the Isles. The Clanranalds and most of the other Islemen are loyal to him, and would shelter and receive him. Skye is hostile, but elsewhere he will be safe, and would move from island to island or get across to the mainland by night if the pursuit became too hot. What do you say, Ronald?" "I would not try Glasgow unless, as a last resource, Malcolm, you are known to many there, and as I was there of one of the prince's officers on 2 occasions, I might easily be recognized. After some time, when Prince Charles and the principal chiefs and the leaders will either have escaped across the water or been hunted down, things will calm down, but at present we must not try to pass through the Lowlands." "At any rate we cannot try to do so till your shoulder is completely healed, and you can use your arm naturally, but I do not think that we had better try and cross to the Isles just at present. If Prince Charles is there, or is believed by the English to be there, the search will be so keen that every stranger would be hunted down, and although the Highlanders might risk imprisonment and death for the prince himself, they could not be expected to run the same risk for anyone else. If the prince escapes it will be because the whole population are with him, and every man, woman, and child is trying to throw the pursuers off the scent. No, I think we should be safer in Edinburgh itself than in the Isles. We will make a shift to live as we can for a month or so. By that time I hope you will be able to use one arm as well as the other, and we will then go boldly down into the Lowlands in our old characters as 2 drovers." "That will be the best plan, no doubt," Ronald agreed. "The difficulty will be getting over the next month." "We shall manage that," Malcolm said. "Fortunately you have still got some money left." "Yes, I have over £50. It was lucky I was able to draw it, as we returned north, from the man I left it with at Carlisle." "Yes, and you wanted to give it back to the treasury," Malcolm said, "and would have done it if I had not almost quarrelled with you about it, saying that it had been given you for a certain purpose, that you had carried out that purpose, and had therefore a right to it, and that you would only be looked upon as a fool if you offered to pay it back. However, there it is now, and lucky it is you have got it. However hard the times, however great the danger, a man will hardly starve in Scotland with £50 in his pocket. So now we will turn our faces west, and make for the head of one of the lochs. There are plenty of fish to be had for catching, and with them and a little oatmeal and a bottle or 2 of whisky we can live like lords." They walked for some hours, and stopped for the night in the hut of a shepherd, who received them hospitably, but could give them but little food, his scanty supplies being almost exhausted, for, as he told them, "The hills are full of fugitives, and those who come all cry for meat. As for meat, there is no want of it. Men won't starve as long as there are sheep and cattle to be had for lifting them, and at present there are more of these than usual in the hills, for they have all been driven up from the villages lest they should fall into the hands of the troopers. But meal is scarce, for men dare not go down into the villages to buy, and we can only get it when the women bring it up as they have a chance." In the morning the shepherd gave them directions as to the way they should take, and a few hours later they came down upon the head of one of the many deep inlets on the western coast. A small fishing boat stood on the shore, but they dared not descend into this, but made their way to the point where, as the shepherd had told them, a stream flowed from a mountain tarn some miles inland made its way down into the sea. The banks were thickly wooded for some 2 miles from its outlet, beyond that was a moorland covered with heather. They determined to encamp near the upper edge of the wood, and at once set to with their swords to cut down branches and construct a hut. This was completed before dusk, and Malcolm then started for the village on the seashore. Ronald besought him to be most careful. "There is likely," he said, "to be a party of soldiers in every village round the coast, for they will know that all the chiefs and officers would be making for the sea. The clansmen have only to remain in the hills until this persecution dies out, and then go quietly home again. But for the leaders the only hope is escape by sea." "I will be careful, lad," Malcolm said. "I shall not enter the village, but will hang about in its outskirts until I come across some one, and with plenty of money in my pocket it is hard if I cannot manage to get a bag of meal and a net, even if the place is full of English soldiers." 3 hours later Malcolm returned laden with a sack containing 40 pounds of meal, a jar with 2 gallons of whisky, and a net. "There," he said, as he entered. "We can do for a month now, if needs be. There is a party of militia in the village, and I hear the whole coast is closely watched, and there are a number of English cruisers among the islands." "How did you get the things?" "I waited till a woman came down with a bundle of faggots, and told her what I wanted. She at first said it was impossible, but when I said I was prepared to pay well she altered her tone, and said she would send her husband out to me. He soon came, and after some bargaining he agreed to bring me out the things I wanted for 3 pounds, and here they are. I see you have got a fire alight, so we will make some cakes at once. I have brought a griddle and 2 horns with me." The next morning they set work to fish. The net was stretched across the lower end of a pool, and they then stripped and waded in, splashing and throwing stones as they went. It was just up to their necks in the deepest parts, shallowing to 2 feet below. When they reached the net they found 2 fine salmon caught there, and carrying these ashore they split one and placed it above the fire. The net was then removed, and in half an hour they were sitting down to a breakfast of grilled salmon and hot oatmeal cakes, which Ronald thought the most delicious repast he had ever tasted. For 3 weeks they remained at this spot. They were not always alone, being sometimes joined for a day or 2 by other fugitives, who, like themselves, were wandering near the sea-coast seeking escape. These seldom stayed long, for it was felt unsafe to keep in parties of more than 2 or 3 at the utmost. Some of the fugitives were in wretched condition, having been wandering among the moors and forests for weeks, and as the fishing was very successful, Ronald and Malcolm were able to give them at parting a good supply of smoked salmon, and a portion of meal, of which Malcolm from time to time brought up a fresh supply from the village. The people there knew little of what was passing in the outer world, but from the conversation of the soldiers they were sure that Prince Charles had so far escaped capture, and an opinion began to prevail that he had succeeded in making his escape by sea, in spite of the vigilance of the English cruisers. By the end of the 3 weeks even Malcolm admitted that Ronald's wound was completely cured. 2 large blue scars showed where the bullet had passed through, and beneath this could be felt a lump where the broken bone had knitted together, and this would in time become as strong as the rest of the shoulder. Malcolm's splints had done their duty, and the eye could detect no difference between the level or width of the 2 shoulders. Ronald could move his arm freely in all directions, and, except that he could not at present venture to put any strain upon the arm, he might be considered as perfectly cured. They determined therefore to continue their way. In the first place, however, it was necessary to procure other clothes, for Ronald was still in uniform, and although Malcolm's attire was not wholly military, it yet differed materially from that of a countryman. "We shall have to get other clothes when we get south," Malcolm said, "for a Highlander's dress would be looked upon with as much suspicion in Glasgow as would that uniform of yours. But until we get down to the lowlands, the native garb will be the best." Accordingly he paid another visit to the village, and with the utmost difficulty persuaded the man he had before dealt with to bring him 2 suits of clothes, such as were worn by the fishermen there. In these, although Malcolm's small stock of Gaelic would betray them at once for other than they seemed to the first clansmen who might address them, they could pass muster with any body of English troops they might meet by the way. Before starting they caught and smoked as many salmon as they could carry, as the fishermen of the coast were in the habit of exchanging fish for sheep with their inland neighbours. They cut each a short pole, and slung some fish at each end, and then placing it on their shoulder, started on their way. They kept along the hillside until they struck the track, for it could scarcely be called a road, leading from the village into the interior, and then boldly followed this, for the difficulty of travelling across the hilly and broken country was so great that they preferred to run the slight extra risk of keeping to the road, feeling certain that for the first day's march at least their appearance and the fish they carried would answer for themselves with any body of troops they might meet. Of this, however, they did not think there was much chance. The authorities would long since have learned the futility of hunting the fugitives among the hills, and would be confining their efforts to the sea-coast. They were now at a considerable distance from the scene of the bloody persecutions of Cumberland and Hawley, and although in other parts of Scotland severer measures might be adopted against unknown adherents of the Stuarts, it was among the Highland clans only that savage and wholesale massacres were being carried into effect. Occasionally, in the course of the day's walk, they met with clansmen passing along the road. These generally passed with a brief word of greeting in Gaelic. One or two who stopped to speak recognized at once by Malcolm's accent that the wayfarers were not what they pretended to be, but they asked no questions, and with a significant smile and an expression of good wishes went on their way. At the village where they stopped, after a long day's journey, the same line of conduct was observed towards them. The inhabitants guessed at once that they were in disguise, but the edicts against those who assisted fugitive insurgents were so severe that none made any open sign of their recognition. They paid for their night's lodging and food with a portion of their fish, which they were indeed glad to get rid of. The next day they resumed their journey, and towards sunset arrived at a village where they saw a party of English cavalry, who had apparently just arrived. The men were cleaning their horses, and an officer was sitting on a bench in front of the principal house in the village, for he had already made a close inspection of every house in the village, and the angry faces of the women and sullen looks of a few men there showed how they resented the disturbance of their households. It was too late to retreat, and Malcolm and Ronald walked boldly to the public house in the centre of the village. The officer at once rose and walked across to him. "Who are you?" he asked, "and where do you come from?" Malcolm shook his head and said in Gaelic, "I do not understand English." "What fools these people are!" the officer exclaimed. "Ho, within there!" The landlady came to the door. "Do you speak English?" "I speak a little," the woman said. "Just ask these men who they are and where they come from." The woman asked the question in Gaelic, and Malcolm replied, "We are, as you see, fishermen, and we come from Huish." As he spoke there was a slight change in the woman's face, but it passed away, and she translated Malcolm's answer to the officer. "But that is 40 miles away," the officer said. "What do they do with their fish at this distance from their homes?" The question being put in Gaelic by the woman, Malcolm replied that owing to the boats being seized by the soldiers, and trade being at a standstill, they could no longer make a living at home, and were therefore on their way to Glasgow to ship as sailors. They were carrying their fish with them to pay for their food and lodging on the way. The story was probable enough, and the officer's suspicion was allayed. "They are fine-looking fellows, both of them," he said to himself as he returned to his bench. "Father and son, I suppose. The young one would make a strapping soldier. Like enough he was at Culloden. However, thank goodness, I have no grounds for suspecting or detaining them. I am sick of this brutal business of fugitive hunting. We are officers and not butchers, and this slaying of brave men who have met us fairly in battle is a disgrace to the British name." Ronald and Malcolm followed the woman into the house. "I am ready to buy some of your fish," she said in a loud tone of voice in Gaelic, "for there will be many to feed this evening. As my house is full of soldiers, I cannot take you in, but if you like, you can sleep in that shed over there. I can cook one of your fish for you, and let you have some black bread, but that is all I can do. Now, how much do you want for the fish?" Malcolm named a low price, and the woman took 3 or 4 of the largest. For these she offered him the price he had asked. He glanced round, and seeing that they were not overlooked, he shook his head. "We don't want money," he said. "We are well provided. Many thanks for keeping our secret." The woman nodded, and without another word the two went out and sat down on a stone bench outside until the landlady brought out a platter with the fish and some black bread. This they ate where they sat. Malcolm then went in to get some tobacco, and returned with his pipe alight, and sat with Ronald watching with apparent interest the operations of the soldiers until night closed in. Then they retired to the shed the landlady had pointed out, and found that a large bundle of freshly gathered rushes had been shaken out to form a bed. Carrying in their poles with their no diminished load of fish, they closed the door and threw themselves down upon the rushes. "That has passed off well," Malcolm said. "Tomorrow we will only go a mile or so out of the village, and stop in the first wood we come to, and go on at night. 30 miles will take us close down to Dumbarton, and there we must manage to get some fresh clothes." "We shall be able to leave our poles behind us," Ronald said, "and that will be a comfort. Although my load of fish was not nearly as heavy as yours, still carrying it on one's shoulder was no joke, and I shall be heartily glad to get rid of it." "I shall not be sorry myself," Malcolm said, "for there will be no occasion to waste the fish. We shall be up and away long before the soldiers are stirring, and we may as well hand them over as a present to the landlady." This was done, and at an early hour in the morning they were upon the road again. After an hour's walking they stopped in a wood till evening, and then continued on their way until they reached Dumbarton, where they threw themselves down beside some boats drawn up upon the shore, and slept till the morning. They then boldly entered the town, and as their garb was similar to that of the men who brought down the fish caught at the villages on the coast, no attention whatever was paid to them. They had no difficulty in purchasing the clothes they required, and carrying them out of the town they changed in the first retired spot they reached, and, as two Lowland drovers, tramped on to Glasgow. With their bonnets pulled well down over their eyes they entered the town. They had little fear of discovery, for none would be likely to recognize in Ronald the gaily dressed young officer of Prince Charles. As to Malcolm, he felt safe from molestation. He was of course known to many drovers and others, but they would not concern themselves with what they had been doing since he last saw them, and even had they noticed when he was there with Ronald, would not denounce an old comrade. He went therefore boldly to the little inn where he had been in the habit of staying when in the city. "Ah, Malcolm, is that you, man?" the landlord said as he entered. "I didna think o' seeing you again. I thought it likely you were laying stiff and stark out somewhere on the moors. Eh, man, you are a foolish fellow to be mixing yourself up in the affairs of others." "I have done with it now, Jock, for good and all," Malcolm said, "and am going back to my old trade again." "I think you are a fool to come back here so soon. There's mony a one mark ye as ye rode in behind that young officer of the prince's, and if they denounced you now they would soon clap ye in between four wolves." "Hoots, man," Malcolm laughed, "who would trouble themselves about a body like me?" "There are bloody doings up in the Highlands," the landlord said gravely, "if all they say is true." "It is true, Jock, more shame to them, but they wouldn't do it in Glasgow what they are doing there. They are hunting down the clansmen like wild beasts, but here in the Lowlands they will not trouble themselves to ask who was for King George and who was against him, except among those who have got estates they can confiscate." "Maybe no," the landlord replied. "Still, Malcolm, if you will take my advice you won't show yourself much in the streets, nor your friend either," he added significantly. "You may be safe, but the citizens are smarting yet over the requisitions that were made upon them, and your friend had best keep in his room as long as ye stay here." Malcolm nodded. "He will be careful, Jock, never fear. We shall be off again as soon as we get a chance. I will leave him here while I go down to the town and find whether there is a herd starting for England. If there is we will go with it. If not, I shall try and get a passage by sea." Malcolm could not hear of any drove of cattle going south. The troubles had, for the time, entirely put a stop to the trade. After it was dark he went to Andrew's. His brother's face expressed both pleasure and dismay at seeing him. "Right glad I am to see you have got safely through it all, Malcolm, but you must be mad to show yourself here again at present. But how is the boy? We have troubled sorely over him. I trust that he too has come safely through it?" "Safe and sound, Andrew, save that he had a bullet through his shoulder at Culloden, but he is tight enough again now." "And what have you been doing ever since?" "Curing his shoulder and fishing." Malcolm briefly related their adventures since Culloden. "And is he here with you in Glasgow, Malcolm? Surely you are not mad enough to bring him here, where he is known to scores of people as one of the rebel officers?" "He is here sure enough," Malcolm said, "and safer than he has been for some times. It is nearly 2 months since Culloden, and people are beginning to think of other things, except in the Highlands, where those fiends Cumberland and Hawley are burning and slaying. Ronald is dressed like a drover, and no one is likely to recognize him. However, he will remain within doors. And now, brother, I want you to take us a passage in the next vessel sailing for London. If I go to a shipper he may ask questions, and like enough it may be necessary to get passes signed before we can go on board." "Certainly it is," Andrew said. "A strict lookout is kept to prevent the rebel leaders from escaping, and no captain of a ship is permitted to take a passenger unless he is provided with a pass, signed by a magistrate, saying that he is a peaceable and well-known person." "But just at present we are both peaceable persons, Andrew, and we can certainly claim to be well-known citizens." "It is no joking matter, Malcolm, I can tell you," Andrew said, irritably, "but of course I will see what I can do. And now I will put on my bonnet and come with you and have a chat with Ronald. It will not do to bring him here tonight, but we must arrange for him to come and see Janet before he sails. I shall not tell her anything about it till he is ready to start, for you know she is very particular, and I am afraid I shall have to say what is not quite true to get the order. I can sign it myself, but it must have the signature of the provost too." So saying, he took his cap and accompanied Malcolm to the lodging. "Stay here a moment, Andrew," Malcolm said, when he arrived within a few yards of the little inn. "I will see that there is no one drinking within. It wouldn't look well to see a decent bailie of the city going into a liquor shop after dark. It will be best for me to fetch him out here, for I doubt there's any room where you could talk without fear of being overheard." Ronald, who was sitting with his cap pulled down over his eyes as if asleep in a corner of the room, where 2 or 3 drovers were talking, was called out by Malcolm. "I am right glad to see you again," Andrew Anderson said heartily. "Janet and I have passed a ill time since the battle was fought. Elspeth has kept up our hopes all along. She said she was sure you were alive, quite downright sure, and though neither Janet or I have faith in superstitions, the old woman's assertions that she should assuredly know if you were both dead did somehow keep up our spirits. Besides, I had faith in Malcolm's knowledge of the country, and knew you were both famous for getting into scrapes and out of them, so I thought that if neither bullet nor sabre had stretched you on the moor of Culloden, you would manage to win your way out of the trouble somehow. However, I think you are pretty safe here. The bloody doings of Cumberland have shocked every Scotchman, and even those who were the strongest against the Stuarts now cry shame, and so strong is the feeling that were the prince to appear now with a handful of followers, I believe the whole country would rise in his favour. So deep is the wrath and grief at the red slaughter among the Highlands that there would not be many Scotchmen found who would betray a fellow Scot into the hands of these butchers. I will make inquiry tomorrow as to what ships are sailing, and will get you a passage in the first. There may be some difficulty about the permit, but if I can't get over it we must smuggle you on board as sailors. However, I don't think the provost will ask me any questions when I lay the permit before him for his signature. He is heart and soul for the king, but like us all he is sick at heart at the news from the north, and would, I think, shut an eye if he saw a Jacobite making his escape. And now, lad, I must be going back, for the hour is getting late, and Janet does not know why I am away. Come to us tomorrow evening as soon as the shop closes. Janet and Elspeth will be delighted to see you, and we will have a long talk over all that you have gone through." On the following evening Ronald and Malcolm presented themselves at Andrew's, and were received with delight by Elspeth and Mrs. Anderson. The latter had, while the rebellion appeared to have a chance of success, been its bitter opponent, and had spoken often and wrathfully against her husband's brother and Ronald embarking in such an enterprise, but with its overthrow all her enmity had expired, and she would have been ready to give assistance not only to them, but to any other fugitive trying to escape. "I have good news for you," Andrew said, when the first greetings were over. "A vessel sails in the morning, and I have taken passages for you in it, and, what is more, have brought your permits. I went to the provost and said to him, 'Provost, I want you to sign these permits for 2 friends of mine who are wanting to go up to London.' 'Who are they?' said he. 'They are just 2 drover bodies,' I said. He looked at me hard. 'One question, Andrew. I know how you feel just at present. You are a loyal man like myself, but we all feel the same. I will sign your permit for any save one. Give me your word that neither of these men is Charles Stuart. I care not who they may be, but as a loyal subject of King George I cannot aid his arch enemy to escape.' 'I give you my word, Provost,' I said. 'One is—' 'I don't want to know who they are,' he interrupted. 'I'd rather not know. It is enough for me that you shall give your word that neither of them is Charles Stuart.' And he took the pen and signed the permit. Between ourselves," he went on, "I shall be glad to hear that the misguided young man is safe across the water, but as Provost of Glasgow I could lend no help to him to go." "They say he has got safe away already," I said. "I think not, Andrew. The coast has been too closely watched for that. The young man is hiding somewhere among the Isles, among the Clanranalds or Macdonalds. I fear they will have him yet. I dread every day to get the news, but I hope beyond all things that if they do lay hands on him it will be through the treachery of no Scot." "I hope not, Provost," I said. "They haven't got over throwing it in our teeth that we sold King Charles to Cromwell." So we just shook hands and said goodbye, and here is the permit. They spent a long evening talking over the past. "I wonder if I shall ever see you again, Ronald," Mrs. Anderson said, with tears in her eyes, as they rose to say goodbye. "You need nor fear about that, Janet woman," her husband said. "Ronald and Malcolm I fall on their legs, and we shall see them back again like two bad pennies. Besides," he went on, more seriously, "there will be an end of these savage doings in the north before long. Loyal men in Scotland are crying out everywhere against them, and the feeling in England will be just as strong when truth is known there, and you will see that before long there will be a general pardon granted to all except the leaders. Fortunately Ronald and Malcolm are not likely to be in the list of exceptions, and before a year is up they will be able to come back if they will without fear of being tapped on the shoulder by a king's officer." "I shall come back again if I can, you may be sure," Ronald said. "Of course I do not know yet what my father and mother's plans may be, but for myself I shall always look upon Scotland as my home, and come back to it as soon as I have an opportunity." "You do not intend to stay in the French army?" "Certainly not. After the treatment my father has received I have no inclination to serve France. The chief reason why Scotchmen have entered her service has been that they were driven from home, and that they looked to France for aid to place the Stuarts on the throne again. Now that the time has come, France has done nothing to aid, and has seen the Stuart cause go down without striking a blow to assist it. I consider that cause is lost for ever, and shall never again draw my sword against the House of Hanover. Nor have I had any reason for loving France. After living in a free country like Scotland, who could wish to live in a country where one's man's will is all powerful, where the people are still no better than serfs, where the nobles treat the law as made only for them, whereas, in my father's case, a man may not even marry according to his own will without incurring the risk of a life's imprisonment? No, I have had enough of France, and if I ever get the opportunity I shall return to Scotland to live." The next morning early Ronald and Malcolm embarked on board a ship. Their permits were closely scrutinized before the vessel started, and a thorough search was made before she was allowed to sail. When the officers were satisfied that no fugitives were concealed on board, they returned to shore, and the vessel started on her voyage for London. End of chapter 19. Recording by Adele de Pignerolles.
Chapter 20 of Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden by G.A. HENTY. Chapter 20. Happy Days. On arriving in London, after 10 days' voyage, Ronald and Malcolm obtained garments of the ordinary cut. The one attired himself as an English gentleman, the other in a garb suitable to a confidential attendant or steward, and after a stay of 2 or 3 days, they made their way back by coach down to Southampton. Here they remained for a week, and then effected a bargain with the captain of a fishing lugger to set them on shore in France. As the two countries were at war, this could only be done by landing them at night at some quiet spot on the French coast. The lugger cruised about a couple of days, and then, choosing a quiet night when there was a mist on the water, she ran in as closely as she dared, and the boat was lowered, and Malcolm and Ronald were rowed to the shore and landed a few miles south of Boulogne. When it was light, they made their way to a village, but here few questions were asked of them, for many refugees from Scotland and England were crossing to France. As they had been well provided with funds by Andrew, they posted to Paris, and on arriving there, put up at the inn where they had stopped on the occasion of their first visit. "We must be careful," Malcolm said, "how we stir out until we know how things stand. The first thing to do is to find out whether the regiment is still in Paris. This they were not long in doing, as their host was able to inform them at once that it had left the capital several months before, and on comparing dates they found that its departure had followed within a day or two of that of their own flight from Paris. It was no doubt meant as a punishment, Ronald said, as Colonel Hume for acting as my second in that affair with the Duke. I hope that no further ill befell him. His mind was set easy on this score by the news that Colonel Hume had accompanied his regiment. On asking after Marshal Saxe, they learned that he was away on the frontier, where he had been carrying on the war with great success. Antwerp, Mons, Namur, and Charleroi all having been captured. The king was in person with the army. This being the case, Ronald saw that it was of no use remaining in Paris, as he was without friend or protector there, as he dared not rejoin his regiment until he learned whether the king's anger was as hot as ever. He therefore started at once with Malcolm and travelled down to La Grignon. It was a joyful meeting between him and his parents, who were in the greatest anxiety respecting him, for although he had written several times, communication was uncertain owing to the war, the only chance of sending letters being by such French vessels as arrived at Scottish ports after running the gauntlet with English cruisers. Some of these had been captured on the way back, and only 2 of Ronald's letters had arrived safely. The last of these had been written a few days after the Battle of Falkirk, and Ronald had then stated that he no longer had any hope of the final success of the expedition. They had received the news of the defeat of Culloden, and had since passed nearly 3 months of painful suspense, relieved only by the arrival of Ronald himself. He found his mother looking well and happy. His father had somewhat recovered from his rheumatism, and looked a younger man by some years than when he saw him last. "He will recover fast now," the countess said, "but he is worried about you night and day, Ronald. I hope that you will stay with us for a time. We have seen so little of you yet." Ronald learned that a few days after his flight an officer had appeared at the chateau with the royal order for his arrest, and it was from him that his parents had first learned the news of his duel with the Duc de Chateaurouge and its result. "I can hardly believe my ears, Ronald," his father said. "To think that my son, scarce a man yet, should have killed in a fair fight one of the first duelists in France. It seemed almost incredible. Malcolm told me that you were a first-rate swordsman, but this seemed extraordinary indeed. The officer remained here for 3 days, and then, convinced that you had not made in this direction, left us. A day or 2 afterwards we received a letter you wrote from us in Nantes, saying that you were starting for Scotland with the prince. I grumbled sorely over my rheumatism, I can tell you, which prevented my drawing my sword once more for the Stuarts, but it was no use my thinking of it." "No, indeed," the countess said, "and I can tell you, Ronald, that had he been ever so well I should not have let him go. After being separated from one's husband for 16 years, one is not going to let him run off to figure as a knight errant at his pleasure." "Your friend Colonel Hume wrote to us," the colonel said with a smile at his wife's word, "giving us details of the duel and speaking of your conduct in the highest terms. He said that at the present the king was furious, but that he hoped in time he would get over it. Colonel Hume had seen Marshal Saxe, who had promised on the first opportunity to speak to the king, and to open his eyes to the character of his late favourite, and to tell him of the attempts which the Duke had made to prevent the royal orders for our release being carried out, and to remove you by assassination. 2 months ago he wrote again to us from Antwerp, which had just fallen, saying that Marshal Saxe had bid him tell us the king was in much more favourable disposition, and that he had taken the opportunity, when his majesty was in good humour, to tell him the whole circumstances of your journey with the orders for our release, and that in consequence the king had made other inquiries respecting the late duke, and had acknowledged that he had been greatly deceived as to his character. At the same time, as your name had been by the king's order removed from the list of officers of the Scottish Dragoons immediately after the duel, he recommended that should you return to France you should not put yourself in the king's way or appear at all in public for the present. The marshal," Colonel Hume wrote, "has made your affair a personal matter, and he, as is his habit in war, will persevere until he succeeds. His reputation and influence are higher than ever, and are daily rising. Be assured that when the campaign is over and he reaps all the honours to which he is entitled, he will push your claim as before." In the first week in October the suspense from which they had suffered as to the fate of Prince Charles was relieved by the news that on the 29th of September he had landed safely at the little port of Roscoff near Morlaix. He made his way to Paris, and Ronald, accompanied by Malcolm, took horse at once and rode there to pay his respects to the prince, and congratulate him on his escape. The prince received him with great warmth and cordially, and from his own lips Ronald learned the story of his adventures. He had, 8 days after Culloden, embarked for the cluster of islets to which the common name of the Long Island is applied. After wandering from place to place, and suffering greatly from hunger, he gained South Uist, where he wants were relieved by Clernold. The English, suspecting or learning that he was there, landed 2,000 men on the island, and commenced an active search for him. He must have been detected had not Flora Macdonald, stepdaughter of a captain in the militia regiment, which formed part of the troops who had landed, upon being appealed to by Lady Clanrald, nobly undertake to save him. She obtained from her stepfather a passport to proceed to Skye, with a manservant and maid. Charles was dressed in female clothes, and passed as Betty Borick, while a faithful Highlander, Neil McEachman, acted as her servant. They started at night in an open boat, and disembarked in Skye. Skye was ever a hostile country, as its chief, Sir Alexander Macdonald, who had first wavered, was now a warm supporter of the Hanoverians, and was with the Duke of Cumberland. Nevertheless, Flora appealed to his wife, Lady Margaret, a daughter of the Earl of Eglinton, and informed her that her attendant was Prince Charles in disguise. Lady Margaret nobly responded to her appeal. Her own house was full of militia officers, and she entrusted Charles to the charge of Macdonald and Kinsborough, her husband's kinsman and factor, who took the party to his house. The next day Charles took leave of Flora Macdonald with warm expressions of gratitude, and passed over the Isle of Rasay in the disguise of a male servant. Thence he made his way to the mainland, where on landing he was compelled to lie in concealment for 2 days, cooped up within a line of sentries. After many dangers, he took refuge in a mountain cave inhabited by 7 robbers, who treated him with the greatest kindness, and supplied his wants. For 3 weeks he remained with them. After many other adventures, he joined his faithful adherents Cluny and Lochneil, who were in hiding in a retreat on the side of Mount Benlader, and here he lived in comparative comfort until he heard that 2 French vessels under the direction of Colonel Warren of Dillon's regiment had anchored in Loch Nana. Travelling by night, he made his way to that place, and embarked on the 20th of September, attended by Lochneil, Colonel Roy Stewart, and about 100 other fugitives who had learned of the arrival of the French vessels. It was almost precisely the spot at which he had disembarked 14 months before. A fog concealed the vessel as she passed through the British fleet lying to intercept her, and they reached Roscoff after a 9 days' voyage. Such was the tale which Prince Charles told Ronald. He had, after Culloden, entirely recovered his high spirits, and had borne all his fatigues and hardships with the greatest cheerfulness and good humour, making light of hunger, fatigue, and danger. Ronald only remained 2 days in Paris, and then returned home. In October the campaign of Flanders ended with a complete defeat of Prince Charles at Lorraine at Rancau, and Marshal Saxe returned to Paris, where he was received with enthusiasm by the population. The royal residence of Chambord was granted for him for life, and he was proclaimed Marshal General of the King's armies. A fortnight later Colonel Leslie received a letter from him saying that he had received His Majesty's command, that he with the Countess and his son should present themselves in Paris, and that he was happy to say that the King's disposition was most favourable. They set off at once. On their arrival they called upon Marshal Saxe, who greeted the colonel as an old friend, and refused to listen to the warm expression of gratitude of Leslie and the Countess. "Say nothing about it, madam," he exclaimed. "Your son won my heart, and I was only too glad to be of service to him and my old comrade here. What is the use of a man winning victories if he cannot lend a helping hand to help his friends?" The next day they went down to Versailles, where Marshal Saxe presented them to the king in a private audience. Louis received them graciously. "I fear, Countess, that you and your husband have been treated with some harshness, but our royal ear was deceived by one in whom we had confidence. Your husband and yourself were wrong in marrying without the consent and against the will of your father, and such marriages cannot be permitted. But at the request of Marshal Saxe, who has done so much for France that I cannot refuse anything he asks, I have now consented to pardon and overlook the past, and I have ordered my chancellor to prepare an order reinstating you in all the possessions and estates of the Countess your mother. I hope that I shall often see you together with your husband and son, both of whom have done good service as soldiers of France. at my court, and now that I see you," he said with a gracious smile, "I cannot but feel how great a loss our court has suffered by your long absence from it." Upon leaving the king's private chamber and entering the great audience hall, Colonel Hume came up and grasped the hand of his old friend, and was introduced by him to his wife, while many of the courtiers, who were either connections or friends of the family of the countess, also gathered round them, for the news that she was restored to royal favour had spread quickly. The countess knew how small was the real value of such advances, but she felt that it was best for her husband and son's sake to receive them amicably. For a few weeks they remained in Paris, taking part in the brilliant fetes which celebrated the success of the French armies, and then retired to the handsome chateau which was now the property of the countess. Here they lived quietly for 2 years, making occasional visits to Paris. At the end of that time Ronald received a letter from Andrew Anderson, to whom he had written several times since his return to France. He told him that he had just heard that Glenlyon and the rest of the property which had been confiscated after the rising of 1715 was for sale. It had been bestowed upon a neighbouring chief who had been active in the Hanoverian cause. He was now dead without leaving issue, and his wife, an English lady, was anxious to dispose of the property and return to England. "I do not know whether your father is disposed to buy back his estates," Andrew wrote, "but I hear that a general amnesty will be very shortly issued to all who took part in the insurrection, saving only certain notorious persons. The public are sick of bloodshed. There have been upwards of 80 trials and executions, besides the hundreds who were slaughtered in the Highlands. Besides this, thousands have been transported. But public opinion is now so strong, and persons of all shades of politics are so disgusted with the brutal ferocity which has been shown, that it is certain government will ere long be compelled to pass an act of amnesty. In the meantime, if it should be your father's wish to purchase the property, I can buy it in my name. The price asked is very low. The income arising from it is stated to be about 400 a year, and 400,000 pounds will be accepted for it. I understand that, as the late owner took no part in the insurrection, and joined the Duke of Cumberland when he came north, the property is in good condition, and the clansmen have escaped the harrying which befell all those who sided with Charles Stuart." Ronald at once laid the letter before his father, who after reading it through passed it without a word to the countess. "You would like to return to Scotland?" she asked quietly, when she read it. "Do you not hesitate to tell me, dear, if you would? It is no matter to me whether we live there or here, so long as I have you and Ronald with me." Colonel Leslie was silent. "For Ronald's sake," she went on, "perhaps it would be better so. You are both of opinion that the cause of the Stuarts is lost forever, and that he is determined that he will never again take part in any rising. He does not care again to enter French army, nor, indeed, is there any reason why Scotchmen should do so now that they no longer look for the aid of the King of France to set the Stuarts on the English throne. I myself have no ties here. My 15 years of seclusion have separated me altogether from my family, and although they are willing enough to be civil now, I cannot forget that all those years they did nothing towards procuring our liberty. The king has so far given way that he has restored me to my mother's estates, but it was only because he could not refuse Marshal Saxe, and he does not like French lands to be held by strangers. Therefore I feel it sure that were I to ask his permission to sell my estates and retire with you to Scotland, he would at once grant my request." "No, Emile, it would not be fair to accept your generous offer." "But it would be no sacrifice," she urged. "I have little reason to love France, and I can assure you I should be just as happy in your country as in my own." "But it would be exile," the colonel said. "No more exile than you and Ronald are suffering here. Besides, I suppose we should get as many comforts in Scotland as here in France. Of course our estates here will fetch a sum many times larger than that which would purchase Glenlyon, and we need not live all of our time among the mountains you tell me of, but I can go sometimes to Edinburgh or even to London. Even if you did not wish it, I should say it would be far better to do so for Ronald's sake. You have lived so long in France that you may have become a Frenchman, but it is not so with Ronald." It was not until 2 or 3 days later that the discussion came to an end and the countess had her way. Colonel Leslie had resisted stoutly, but his heart beat at the thought of returning to the home of his youth and ending his days among the clansmen who had followed him and his fathers before him. Ronald had taken no part whatever in the debate, but his mother read in his eyes the delight which the thought of returning to Scotland occasioned him. As soon as this was settled they went to Paris, and as the countess had foreseen, the king was pleased at once to give his consent to her disposing of her lands on the approval of the purchaser. No difficulty was experienced on this score, as a noble whose lands adjoined her own offered at once to purchase them. As soon as this was arranged, instructions were sent to Andrew to purchase not only the Glenlyon property, but the other estates of its late owner. In due time a letter was received from Andrew saying that he had arranged for the purchase of the whole for the sum of £13,000, and the money was at once sent over through a Dutch banking house. Very shortly afterwards, at the end of 1747, the Act of General Amnesty was passed, and as Ronald's name was not among those excluded from its benefits, they at once prepared to return to Scotland. The journey was facilitated by the fact that shortly after the passing of the Act, peace was concluded between England and France. Accompanied by Malcolm, Colonel Leslie, the Countess, and Ronald sailed for Scotland. The Colonel and his wife remained in Edinburgh, while Ronald and Malcolm went to Glasgow, where Andrew had in readiness all the papers transferring the estates purchased in his name to Colonel Leslie, who shortly afterwards journeyed north with his wife and son and took possession of his ancestral home amid the enthusiastic delight of the clansmen, who had never ceased to regret the absence of him whom they considered as their rightful chief. There is little more to tell. Colonel Leslie lived but a few years after returning home, and Ronald then succeeded him as Leslie of Glenlyon. He had before this married the daughter of a neighbouring gentleman, and passed his time between Glenlyon and Edinburgh, varied by an occasional visit to London. The countess never regretted her native land, but, happy in the affection of her son and daughter-in-law and their children, lived happily with them until nearly the end of the century. Malcolm remained the faithful and trusty friend of the family, and his brother and wife were occasionally persuaded to pay a visit to Glenlyon, where their kindness to Ronald as a child was never forgotten. Happily, the rising of '45 was the last effort on behalf of the Stuarts. Scotland accepted the decision as final, and the union between the two countries became close and complete. Henceforth, Scotchmen went no longer to fight in the armies of France, but took service in that of their own country, and more than one of Ronald's grandsons fought stoutly in Spain under Wellington. End of chapter 20. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. End of Bonnie Prince Charlie, A Tale of Fontenoy and Culloden by George Alfred Henty.